Winter morning light slipped through the Burrow's kitchen windows and fell in long golden rectangles across the worn wooden floor, as if the house itself had laid out a pattern for the day. Molly Weasley paused in the doorway with her hands on her hips, surveying her domain the way a general might inspect a field before battle. A mug of tea steamed on the table, forgotten, while she took stock of what needed doing. December 23rd, 2 days until Christmas. She had been planning this feast for weeks, months. If she counted the moment back in September, when she'd first begun quietly sorting recipes in her mind and measuring portions by memory alone, this year mattered. This year had to be special. For the first time since the war, every one of her children would be home for Christmas. Bill would be traveling back from Egypt, bringing Fleur and little Victoire. Charlie had managed leave from Romania, wrangling it from the Dragon Reserve, with whatever stubborn charm Charlie carried in his bones. Percy had, astonishingly, requested time away from the ministry, though Molly suspected Audrey had nudged him toward that decision. George would close Weasley's Wizard Wheezes for the holiday. Ron had promised to arrive by Christmas Eve, and Molly was still holding on to the hope that Hermione and Harry might come too, if Auror training allowed it. Ginny would be home from her first professional season with the Holyhead Harpies, full of stories and that fierce, bright energy that made the Burrow feel like itself again. Everyone home, together, safe. Molly moved into the kitchen properly, slippers whispering over stone and wood, and the room greeted her with its familiar scent. The Burrow's kitchen never smelled like one thing. It smelled like decades. Cinnamon and rosemary, bread and roasted meat, old soup simmered through lean winters, cakes baked for birthdays, tea made late on nights when worry refused to let her sleep. It was a permanent perfume of persistence. Copper pots hung above the ancient cooker, bottoms polished bright by years of use. Wooden spoons stood at attention in a ceramic crock by the sink. Everything had a place, and Molly liked it that way. She opened the drawer beneath the worktop and pulled out her planning parchments. The stack had grown thick over the past weeks, covered in her cramped handwriting, revisions, and firm little check marks. Menus, shopping lists, preparation schedules organized by day and time. Arthur teased her about it, calling her plans a campaign strategy, but Arthur didn't understand why she needed the organization. He didn't feel the same pressure in his chest when he thought about Christmas. This Christmas had to be perfect, not because she cared about perfection for its own sake, but because she needed what it represented. She needed her family around the table. She needed noise and warmth and the comfortable chaos of everyone talking at once. She needed the proof that the war had not taken everything, that what they had left could still be whole. Molly spread the top parchment across the table and weighed down the corners with whatever was closest: her wand, a bowl of wooden spoons, two slightly mismatched salt cellars. Her finger traced down the menu. Christmas dinner, December 25th, 6 o'clock sharp. Turkey, large enough to feed a small village. Roasted potatoes, honeyed parsnips, Brussels sprouts with chestnuts, bread sauce, cranberry sauce, sausages wrapped in bacon, stuffing, gravy, Christmas pudding, mince pies, brandy butter, trifle. Below that, Christmas Eve supper. Below that, plans for Boxing Day leftovers. Below that, breakfast menus. She had even planned what biscuits would be kept ready for tea. Some people might call it excessive. Molly called it necessary. She picked up her wand and summoned her apron from the hook near the door. It flew across the room and tied itself neatly behind her back. The fabric was faded and soft with use, marked by stains no cleaning charm could ever fully remove. Beetroot from years ago, chocolate from a birthday cake, a splash of pumpkin juice from the morning Ginny got her Hogwarts letter. A map of memories, stitched into cloth. Molly rolled up her sleeves and approached the pantry. The small cupboard door opened at her touch, revealing shelves that stretched much farther back than the external space suggested. One of Arthur's better extension charms. Jars of preserved fruit gleamed in wandlight. Flour and sugar sat in tidy sacks. Dried herbs hung in bundles from the ceiling, carrying the scent of summer gardens into winter. She began pulling out ingredients for the Christmas pudding and laying them on the worktop with careful precision. This had to be done first. The pudding needed time to set, time for flavors to deepen and settle into that rich density that made it feel like the heart of Christmas dessert. Flour, breadcrumbs, sweat, currants, raisins, sultanas, candied peel she'd made herself back in October, cherries like rubies in a jar, mixed spice, cinnamon, nutmeg, brown sugar dark and fragrant, eggs from their own hens, a bottle of stout, brandy saved for special occasions. As she assembled everything, Molly's mind wandered through Christmases past, the year the twins charmed the garden gnomes to sing carols in harmony. The Christmas Percy gave everyone handwritten improvement plans, earnest and ridiculous in his 12-year-old seriousness. The year Ron got his new broom and nearly crashed it through the kitchen window in excitement. The last Christmas before Fred, Molly's hand paused over the bowl. No, not now, not today. This Christmas would be perfect because it had to be, because she needed her family safe around that table. She needed to feed them and care for them, because that was how she kept fear at bay. If she could make the feast happen, if she could make the house full and warm, then she could tell herself, just for a day, that everything was all right. She took down her largest mixing bowl, the ceramic one with a hairline crack down its side, and set it on the worktop with a solid thunk. Then she retrieved the wooden spoon she always used for Christmas pudding. The handle had been worn smooth by her mother's hand and her grandmother's before that. Tradition mattered. It anchored her. The old custom was that everyone in the household should stir and make a wish, moving east to west in honor of the wise men's journey. But it was only Molly this morning, and that was fine. Arthur would stir later. George, when he arrived, maybe. For now, it was her. She measured flour into the bowl by instinct rather than scales, added breadcrumbs, then suet. She tipped in the dried fruits, pausing to pick out anything too hard or stem-like, fingers moving with practiced care. The currants were plump and dark, the raisins sweet and fragrant. She added them in generous handfuls, watching them nestle among the dry ingredients like treasure. Sugar followed, then spices, then a pinch of salt. The kitchen began to smell like Christmas, that particular blend of cinnamon and citrus and dried fruit that made winter evenings feel softer. She cracked eggs into a smaller bowl, yolks bright from well-fed hens, and whisked them quickly. Then came the stout, dark and foamy, poured in with steady confidence, followed by a generous pour of brandy that made the mixture glisten. Molly tipped the wet ingredients into the dry and took up her grandmother's wooden spoon. The batter was heavy work. It resisted, thick with fruit, and the spoon dragged through it with satisfying weight. Molly stirred in smooth, deliberate circles, east to west, the old words coming automatically, as if the kitchen itself remembered them. May this pudding bring joy and health to all who taste it. And what did she wish for? The same thing she always wished for in the quietest part of her heart. Keep them safe. Keep them together. As the mixture came together, its color deepening into that rich, dark brown that promised indulgent flavor, Molly felt the steadiness of the task settle her. This was love, translated into flour and fruit and effort. This was how she cared. This was how she held the world in place. When it was ready, she buttered the pudding basin, packed the dense mixture inside, pressed parchment against the surface, and covered the top with muslin, tying it securely with kitchen twine. Her fingers moved through the knots automatically. She had done this every December for decades. She set the steamer on the cooker, charmed the water to boil, lowered the basin, and adjusted the heat until it simmered gently. 6 hours of steaming today cool overnight, then 3 hours on Christmas Day to heat through. Perfect. Molly glanced at the Weasley clock on the wall. Most hands pointed far away. Bill travelling, Charlie travelling, Percy at work, Ron at work, Ginny at Quidditch, George in Diagon Alley. Only Arthur's hand sat at work in the ministry basement. Soon those hands would all swing home. Soon the kitchen would be full of voices and laughter, and the comforting chaos of family. She turned back to her lists, reviewing tomorrow's schedule. Mince pies, cranberry sauce, vegetable preparation, bread sauce base. Christmas Eve would be brining and final preparations. It was ambitious. It was enormous. But Molly Weasley had raised 7 children, survived 2 wars, and kept the Burrow standing through more near disasters than she cared to count. She could manage one Christmas feast. She cleaned as she went, restoring the kitchen to order, wiping the worktop, washing the bowl until it gleamed, returning jars and sacks to their shelves. Outside, the garden lay under a thin dusting of snow. A fort-shaped lump near the hedge suggested the gnomes had been busy. The apple tree stood bare against the grey sky, but in summer it would be heavy with fruit again. Seasons turned. Things returned. The pudding steamed patiently behind her, filling the air with spice and promise. In 2 days, her family would gather around the table. They would eat what she'd made. They would laugh and argue and tell stories. They would be together. For one day, everything would be as it should be. Molly poured herself fresh tea, sat at the table with her parchment spread out, and began making small notes in the margins, tightening the schedule, adjusting the order of tasks. Outside, afternoon dimmed toward evening. Inside, the Burrow was warm, and the Christmas pudding bubbled quietly behind her, steady and patient, becoming something rich and wonderful. Everything was going according to plan. Everything would be perfect. The kitchen was already warm when Molly came down the stairs on the afternoon of December 23rd, though she knew she had banked the fire before bed the night before. The Burrow did that sometimes. It held heat the way it held memories, as if the house itself refused to let the cold settle too deeply into its bones. The Christmas pudding sat cooling on the windowsill where she had left it after the long steam, wrapped in muslin like a sleeping infant. Weak winter sunlight struggled through the glass, throwing the room into shades of grey and soft gold. Molly tied her apron again, tugging the knot tight as if tension could be tied away, and set her lists upright beside the sugar jar so she could see them at all times. The top sheet was already marked with neat check marks from yesterday's work. Today would need more: mince pies, cranberry sauce, vegetable prep, bread sauce base, and in between those things, all the little tasks that never appeared on lists but always happened anyway. Wiping flour from the floor, chasing the chickens away from the back door, persuading the gnomes not to steal peelings, checking the pantry 3 times because she never fully trusted that she hadn't forgotten something. She told herself that yesterday had gone well. The pudding was perfect. The kitchen was clean. The plan was holding. Still, as she moved around the room, she noticed an odd sense of liveliness in the air, like the faintest hum beneath the walls. It was the kind of feeling that came before a storm, not in the sky, but in the house. Molly tried to ignore it. The Burrow was old and full of enchantments. Old houses had moods. There was no room in her schedule for superstition. She started with the mince pies. Pastry was a comfort. It had rules. It had logic. It listened when you handled it properly. Molly measured flour into a bowl, then cut in butter, rubbing it in with practiced fingers until the mixture resembled crumbs. She used a small charm to keep the butter cool, because warm butter made stubborn pastry, and she had no patience for stubborn pastry. Sugar, a pinch of salt, a splash of cold water. Fold, 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 until the dough came together smooth and cooperative. She divided it into portions, wrapped them, and slid them into the cold larder to rest. While the pastry chilled, she turned to cranberry sauce because the cranberries didn't care about rest. They cared about heat and time. She poured sugar into her copper pot, added water, then orange zest. The zest gave a bright note to the sweetness, sharp and clean the way Molly liked it. She set the pot on the cooker and flicked her wand to raise the flame. The flame flickered, not in the normal way a flame danced. It flickered as if it were indecisive, swelling too large, then shrinking back, then swelling again with unnecessary enthusiasm. The heat licked up the sides of the copper pot, bright and overeager. Molly frowned and adjusted it again with her wand. It shrank obediently, then immediately flared larger, as if ignoring her instructions in favor of its own preferences. "Behave yourself," she muttered, and adjusted it a third time. This time it held steady, though she had the irritating sense that it was still running slightly hotter than it should. She made a note in the back of her mind. "Clean the cooker grates. Ask Arthur to look at it. Tell him not to get distracted by anything that involved muggle plugs." When the sugar water began to bubble, she tipped in the cranberries. The berries hit the liquid with a soft hiss, then began to bob and roll as the heat took hold. Molly picked up a wooden spoon and stirred gently, working the cranberries through the syrup. The spoon moved the wrong way. Her hand was going clockwise. She was absolutely certain of it. Yet the cranberries swirled counterclockwise, as if the pot itself were insisting on reversing her motion. Molly blinked once, then twice, because the sensible part of her brain tried to convince her she had simply misseen it. She lifted the spoon out, looked at it, then lowered it again. Same thing. The instant the spoon touched the liquid, the stirring reversed, the whole pot obeying a direction opposite to her intent. "That's odd," Molly said aloud, because something about naming strangeness made it feel less powerful. The cranberries continued to cook, though bursting softly and bleeding ruby red into the syrup. The sauce thickened properly. It smelled right. It looked right. If it wanted to swirl backward, it could, she decided. She did not have time to argue with a pot. She left the sauce to simmer and pulled the pastry from the cold larder. She unwrapped the first portion and dusted the worktop with flour. The dough rolled out beautifully, smooth and pliant. Molly pressed a circular cutter into it, stamping out rounds for the bases. She'd pressed them into a muffin tin, spooned mincemeat into each one, the filling dark and glossy with spice and brandy, then turned to cut star tops. She cut 6 stars and placed them neatly, pressing points down with gentle fingers to seal them. She reached for the 7th. It lifted off the worktop before her fingertips touched it. Molly froze, hand suspended midair. The pastry star hovered at about eye level, rotating slowly as if it were considering the room. She had not cast a levitation charm. Her wand was lying on the table beside the flower. She hadn't even breathed a spell. "Come here," she said sharply, because she had never been the sort of woman who begged objects to cooperate. The star drifted lazily upward, just out of reach. Molly's frown deepened. She snatched up her wand and snapped a summoning charm. "Accio pastry." The star shot toward her so quickly she caught it with a startled grunt, fingers closing around it hard enough to crumple a point. Behind her, the remaining pastry stars rose together, lifting in a slow circle above the table like a tiny constellation. Molly's heart thudded once, hard. "Finite incantatem," she said, crisp and firm. The stars dropped at once, thumping softly onto the flowered surface. For a moment, the kitchen held its breath. Molly stood very still, listening, as if the room might speak. It did not. She stared at the stars and tried to come up with a reasonable explanation. Perhaps she had charmed them without thinking. Perhaps she had been distracted, mind running ahead to tomorrow's brining schedule, and her wandless magic had slipped out. The idea irritated her. She did not like the thought of her own concentration failing, not with so much depending on her. But she also did not like the idea that the kitchen was doing things on its own. She finished the mince pies with careful watchfulness, brushing them with beaten egg to give them a golden shine. Then she slid the tin into the oven and glanced at the temperature gauge. The needle swung wildly back and forth, swooping from one end to the other like a pendulum. It ignored the dial entirely. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Molly muttered. She adjusted the temperature. The needle continued its dance. She tried a regulating charm, speaking clearly. For a moment, the needle steadied near the correct setting. Then it resumed its swinging, as if offended by her attempt to impose order. Molly leaned in, squinting. The oven itself felt about right when she opened the door. Heat rolled out steady and warm, not scorching. Perhaps the gauge was broken. That would be manageable. Arthur could fix it. She would not allow a broken gauge to spoil Christmas. She returned to the cranberries. The sauce had thickened beautifully. Even with its backward stirring, she poured it into a clean jar, sealed it, and set it aside to cool. One task done, the afternoon advanced. Shadows lengthened across the kitchen floor. The burrow creaked softly the way it always did, settling into itself. Molly told herself she was being silly. The pastry had behaved once it was pinned down. The oven was heating properly. The cranberries were perfect. All of this was just small oddness layered over normal work. She moved on to potatoes. Peeling potatoes was mindless comfort. Peel, rinse, set aside. Peel, rinse, set aside. The sink water ran warm over her hands. The rhythm soothed her. Behind her, something scraped. Molly glanced over her shoulder and saw through the glass of the oven door that the muffin tin was rising. Not metaphorically, physically, slowly lifting off the rack as if the oven had decided gravity was optional. The tin drifted upward inside the oven cavity, inching toward the top heating element. "No," she said, loud enough that the kitchen should have been embarrassed. She lunged forward and yanked open the oven door. Heat blasted her face. She grabbed the tin with a towel and pulled it out, setting it firmly on the stovetop, as though force alone could convince it to stay. The pies looked fine, pastry just beginning to turn gold, stars crisping at the edges. They should have been happily baking on the middle rack, not floating around like enchanted stepping stones. Molly stared at the oven rack. It was solid, properly positioned. It had not moved. There were no charms on it that she could see. She took a deep breath. Residual magic, she told herself again. Lingering spellwork. Old house, old enchantments. It would settle. She returned to the sink, but the soothing rhythm did not return. She peeled faster, shoulders tight, the back of her neck prickling with awareness. The kitchen felt too awake. When she leaned to rinse the next potato, the sink gurgled, not the normal sound of water draining. This gurgle sounded almost like someone clearing their throat. The water swirled counterclockwise, the same direction the cranberries had insisted on swirling. And as Molly watched, a strip of potato peel rose up through the drain on a thin spout of water and flopped onto the counter beside her. Molly stared at it. "That's enough," she said sharply, though she was not certain what she was addressing. The sink, the house, the universe. Whoever was playing jokes. The peel lay there, innocent. The water continued to swirl. Molly finished the potatoes and dumped them into a pot of cold water to prevent browning. Then she attacked parsnips and Brussels sprouts with the same energy she might have used on a stubborn curse. Peel, chop, trim. She refused to look away for more than a moment at a time. The mince pies finished baking. Molly pulled them out and set them on the cooling rack. They smelled heavenly. Butter and spice. Warm fruit. The scent made the kitchen feel almost normal again. Almost safe. Then the cooling rack began to rotate. It started slowly, a gentle turn, then gathered speed. The mince pies spun in a calm circle, like horses on a carousel. The sight was so absurd, Molly's brain stuttered. It made no sense. A rack did not rotate unless someone turned it. Molly grabbed the edge with both hands. For a heartbeat it resisted, pulling against her grip as if it wanted to keep dancing. Then it stilled, reluctant, like a child made to sit down. Right, Molly said, very calmly, because calm was the only thing holding her together. That is enough, quite enough. She transferred the mince pies to a plain plate with her own hands and covered them with a tea towel. The cooling rack she shoved into the back of a cupboard and shut the door firmly. If it wanted to spin, it could spin in the dark. By the time the garden gate squeaked and Arthur's cheerful off-key whistling drifted in from the shed, Molly felt both relief and dread. Relief at hearing something normal. Dread because she knew if she told Arthur what had happened, he would look intrigued instead of alarmed. And she did not have the patience for intrigued. Arthur came in with a gust of cold air and warmth, cheeks rosy, hair slightly askew. "Something smells wonderful," he said, kissing her cheek. "Baking all day." "More or less," Molly replied. And then, because the words were stuck in her throat like a splinter, she added, "Arthur, have you noticed anything odd about the kitchen lately?" "Odd how?" Molly told him. The backward stirring, the floating pastry stars, the wildly swinging temperature gauge, the levitating muffin tin, the spinning cooling rack. As she spoke, she heard how ridiculous it sounded, like a story Ginny might have made up at 12, like a children's book about a mischievous house. But it had happened. She was not imagining it. Arthur scratched his head, interested. "Could be residual magic," he said. "This kitchen's had layers of spellwork for years. Your cooking charms. The boys' early magic when they were learning. That time Fred and George tried to enchant the sink to wash up on its own. Layers of intent building up. So what do? Molly demanded. "I can't have my kitchen staging a rebellion the day before Christmas." "It might sort itself out," Arthur said optimistically. "Or we could try a general cleansing charm. Though, well, you know how the Burrow can be. It's got its own personality sometimes. Old houses do. Magical homes especially. Maybe it's just in a playful mood." Playful, Molly thought, was fine for gnomes, not for ovens. They made a simple dinner together. Nothing complicated, nothing that required elaborate spellwork. The cooker behaved. The pots stayed still. The kettle did not run away. The normalness soothed Molly enough that she almost convinced herself the day's oddness had been a fluke. Almost. She washed dishes by hand that night, not trusting charms. The water behaved mostly, but the uneasy feeling in her stomach stayed tight and stubborn. Tomorrow would be busier. Tomorrow would require more magic, more timing, more coordination. If the kitchen was going to misbehave, it would choose tomorrow. Molly dried the last plate and hung the tea towel to dry. Outside, December darkness had settled over the garden, turning the hedge and apple tree into silhouettes. A few stars pricked through cloud. The Christmas pudding sat on the windowsill, patient and perfect in its muslin. At least, that had gone to plan. Molly extinguished the lights with a flick of her wand. That charm worked exactly as it should. She followed Arthur upstairs, trying to carry optimism with her like a shield. Tomorrow would go smoothly. It had to. Behind her, in the dark kitchen, copper pots swayed gently on their hooks, even though there was no breeze. Wooden spoons shifted position in their crock, as if rearranging themselves into a new order. The oven's temperature gauge spun one full circle, then settled back to its resting position, as though satisfied. And in the cupboard where Molly had banished it, the cooling rack rotated one final, defiant turn before becoming still. Molly woke on Christmas Eve with the stubborn optimism of someone who refused to believe the world had the right to interfere. The oddness of yesterday sat at the edge of her mind like a faint itch, irritating but easy enough to ignore if she kept moving. She had far too much to do to be unsettled by a backward-staring spoon or an oven gauge that had developed a flair for drama. Old kitchens had quirks. Old magic got temperamental. She had seen stranger things in her life than a levitating muffin tin. She dressed quickly in the pre-dawn dark, pulling on her warmest jumper beneath her working robes. The reinforced hem would withstand flour and spills, and the occasional over-enthusiastic charm. Arthur still slept, snoring softly, one arm flung across her side of the bed. Molly kissed his forehead, a small, automatic gesture of affection that steadied her, and slipped out of the room. Downstairs, the Burrow was quiet in that particular way it always became before a holiday, as if the house were holding its breath and waiting to fill itself with voices. Molly lit her wand and let its glow guide her through familiar corridors. Floorboards creaked gently beneath her slippers. A portrait in the hallway muttered something about people being up at unreasonable hours, then fell silent again. The kitchen door stood slightly ajar. Molly stopped with her hand on the latch, frowning. She distinctly remembered closing it the night before. She had a habit of it. She liked doors shut, work contained, spaces orderly. Still, it was possible Arthur had come down in the night for water and forgotten. Arthur forgot doors. Arthur forgot where he'd put his socks. Arthur sometimes forgot the names of his own ministry departments in the middle of explaining them, drifting into a tangent about plugs instead. Molly pushed the door open and reached for the light switch. She froze. Her bread dough had escaped. It wasn't simply risen too much. It wasn't even a little too enthusiastic. It had expanded in a way that suggested either a disaster, a deliberate prank, or a small-scale magical apocalypse. The dough spilled over the edges of the bowl like a pale waterfall and poured across the worktop in thick, puffy waves. It oozed down cabinet fronts, pooled on the floor in swollen mounds, and continued to rise, as if it had decided that doubling in size was for amateurs. The tea towel she'd placed over it lay crumpled on top, like a flag of surrender. The dough was still rising. Its surface bubbled softly, alive with fermenting warmth. A thick tendril of it had reached the nearest table leg and was inching upward with slow determination, as though the kitchen table had offended it, and it intended to claim higher ground. Molly stood in the doorway for a heartbeat too long, her mind struggling to accept the scene. She had made that bread 100 times. More than that, if she counted all the times she'd made it without thinking, hands moving from muscle memory while her mind drifted elsewhere. The recipe was simple, reliable. It had never once tried to consume the kitchen. "No," she said, voice weak. "No, no, no, no." She stepped forward and immediately regretted it. Her slippers sank into the dough with a soft, unpleasant squelch. It was warm underfoot, springy and resistant, like stepping into a pillow that had decided it didn't want her there. The smell of yeast was strong, thick and sweet, like the inside of a bakery left too long in the sun. Molly lifted one foot and pulled it free with effort. The dough clung, stretching, then snapped back into place with a faintly offended wobble. How much yeast had she put in? 1 packet. Standard amount. She had measured it carefully. She always did, especially when Fleur was coming. Molly had learned that if she wanted everything to go smoothly, she needed to be precise enough that even Fleur could not quietly correct her. She raised her wand and tried to think of a solution that did not involve destroying perfectly good food. Reduction charms were for trunks and teacups, not bread explosions. Vanishing charms were wasteful. Freezing might stop fermentation, but it would also make a frozen dough mountain that would then need dealing with. Reducio, Molly tried, pointing at the nearest mound. The dough shrank obediently for about 3 seconds, drawing itself inward as if finally remembering its manners. Then it puffed back up to its previous size and expanded a little more on top of that, as though offended by her attempt to restrain it. Molly stared at it. She tried again, stronger this time. Reducio. The dough shrank, then rebounded again, swelling toward the pantry door in a slow roll. "All right, then," she muttered. "We're doing this the hard way." She tried a freezing charm. Ice crusted over the dough's surface, a thin, brittle sheen. Underneath it continued bubbling. The ice cracked in delicate lines and broke apart in sheets, sliding off the dough as it rose again. The mass seemed to enjoy the challenge, as if each spell was merely part of a game. Molly tried a banishing charm, aimed at one corner of the dough. The chunk flew across the room and slapped wetly against the wall with a sound like a giant hand clapping. It stuck there for a moment, spreading outward in a slow, disgusting bloom. Then it began to creep upward, defying gravity in a way that made Molly's stomach turn. Dough should not climb walls. Molly's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Arthur," she called, and hated the sharp edge of panic that made its way into her voice despite her best efforts. "Arthur." Upstairs, something thumped. A bed creaked. Footsteps began to thunder down the stairs, heavy and fast, the sound of her husband waking instantly in response to her tone. Arthur burst into the kitchen in his nightshirt, wand raised and ready, eyes wide and alert as if he expected Death Eaters. He stopped in the doorway. His expression changed in stages. Alarm to confusion to a startled sort of interest. "Molly," he said carefully, as if choosing his words mattered. "Why is there so much dough?" "I don't know," Molly said, and her voice did not sound like herself. "I followed the recipe. Exactly. 1 packet of yeast. Proper measurements. I have made this bread 100 times, Arthur. 100. Arthur stepped into the dough and immediately sank to his ankles. He lifted one foot and tried to pull it free. The dough clung, stretching stubbornly before letting go. Arthur blinked down at it as if fascinated. "It's still rising," he observed, which was perhaps the least helpful sentence he could have chosen at that moment. "Yes, Arthur," Molly said through clenched teeth. "That is the problem." Arthur crouched and poked the dough with his wand. The surface wobbled, sending ripples across it like laughter. The dough responded by swelling slightly, as if encouraged. "Right," Arthur said, straightening. "Well, that is certainly unusual." Unusual was a polite word for a kitchen being eaten alive by bread. Together they tried spells. Arthur suggested counter charms, cleansing charms, and one time, with earnest optimism, he suggested that perhaps the dough was reacting to her stress and would calm down if she spoke to it kindly. Molly gave him a look that could have curdled milk. "Arthur," she said, very slowly, "I will not negotiate with bread." Arthur held up his hands in surrender, but he looked faintly amused in that way he sometimes did when chaos unfolded around them. That expression usually made Molly want to hex him, but today it made her want to cry. They attempted to scoop the dough back into the bowl. It was too heavy and too spread out. They tried cutting it into sections with the slicing charm, thinking perhaps smaller portions would be easier to contain. Each section continued rising independently. Worse, it rose faster. Within minutes, the kitchen contained not one bread catastrophe, but several, multiplying like a curse that grew stronger each time you tried to fight it. Molly's breathing grew shallow. Flour dust clung to her robes. Her hair, already pinned back, began to loosen under strain. The dough crept toward the pantry. A swelling mound bulged beneath the table, nudging it slightly. The table legs sank into it and emerged coated in pale paste. Arthur waded through it and fetched buckets from the shed, muttering something about containment, like he was managing a spill rather than a rebellion. They scooped dough into buckets, But the dough rose inside the buckets too, swelling like a trapped creature. They pushed it into corners, and it crept out again. Every solution felt temporary. Finally, exhausted, breathless, covered in flour, they stood in the middle of the kitchen and stared at the mess. "We could send an owl to the leaky cauldron," Arthur said, voice weak, as if he knew even as he spoke that Molly would not accept it. "No," Molly said at once. She looked toward the pantry with a sharp pang of dread. The turkey. Her schedule demanded she collect it today, get it into brine, begin the slow, careful process that would lead to tomorrow's roast. She had planned every hour around it. Without the turkey, there would be no Christmas dinner, the way she had imagined it. And without Christmas dinner as she imagined it, she did not know what would be left of the fragile promise she had been building. Molly picked her way through dough mounds to the pantry. Each step sank and pulled, dough gripping at her slippers, as if it didn't want her to leave. She yanked open the pantry door and stared. The turkey stared back. It was frozen solid. Frost covered its skin. Ice crystals sparkled along the edges of its wings. The bird sat on the cold storage shelf like a statue, stiff and glossy. Molly reached out and tapped it with her knuckles. It rang like a bell. "No," she whispered. She tried a thawing charm. Nothing. She tried a heating charm. Nothing. The turkey remained stubbornly, impossibly frozen. It was not the normal sort of frozen you got from a cold larder. It felt like magic, like someone had layered a spell over it that refused to let warmth touch it. Molly's throat tightened. She backed out of the pantry and nearly tripped over a fresh swell of dough pushing up like a wave. Her hands shook. She caught herself on the doorframe, breathing hard, and felt something panicked begin to build in her chest, tight and bitter. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not with Bill and Charlie arriving tonight. Not with George due any moment. Not with Percy arriving tomorrow morning. Percy, who had finally agreed to come home properly. Percy, who had always loved her cranberry sauce, like it was proof of belonging. Not with this being the first Christmas since the war that might actually feel whole. Molly forced herself toward the kettle. Tea would help. Tea always helped. If she could make a cup of tea, she could pretend for a moment that the world was still orderly enough to boil water. She reached for the kettle. It skittered away from her hand like a startled cat, sliding across the stovetop. Molly stared at it, then reached again. The kettle hopped sideways, then backward. Then it did a ridiculous little spin, as if showing off, and settled just out of reach. "Oh, come on," Molly said, voice raw with exhaustion. She lunged. The kettle darted away again. Behind her, Arthur returned with more buckets and stopped, drawing in a sharp breath. Molly turned. Every pot and pan in the kitchen was moving. The copper pots above the cooker swung on their hooks in complex patterns that almost looked choreographed. Pans on the shelf rearranged themselves by size, then by color, then in a sudden burst of nonsense. Saucepan zids spun past like discs. Mixing bowls formed a ring on the one stretch of floor, not covered in dough, and began rotating slowly, like a sedate carousel. The wooden spoons stood upright in their crock and waved as if conducting. Spatulas flipped in time. Whisks spun on their handles. Measuring cups darted into cupboards and popped out again like they were playing hide-and-seek. Molly's kitchen, her carefully organized, controlled space, had transformed into a symphony of culinary chaos. "Finite incantatum," Arthur shouted, wand raised high. The spell rippled through the room like a wave. For one blessed moment, everything stopped. The pots hung still. The spoons slumped. The cups clattered to the floor and lay quiet. Even the dough seemed to pause, as if considering whether to behave. Then, slowly, deliberately, the kitchen resumed its activity. A pot lid spun past Molly's head with deliberate accuracy. The teapot, her mother's teapot, began to whistle loudly despite holding no water and sitting on no heat. The oven door swung open and shut, like a mouth trying to speak. Arthur looked at Molly, eyes wide. Molly looked at Arthur, lips pressed tight. Perhaps, Arthur said slowly, we should step outside for a moment. They retreated to the garden, dragging the kitchen door closed behind them. The door shut with a decisive click, but it did little to muffle the sounds of chaos inside. Through the kitchen window, they could see the movement continuing, utensils bobbing, dough spreading, lids spinning, everything too alive. Outside, the December morning was cold and quiet. Snow covered the vegetable patch in a smooth blanket. The chicken coop was peaceful, hens murmuring sleepily. A gnome peeked out from behind the shed, took one look at Molly's face, and retreated quickly as if deciding it wanted no part of this. Molly stood in the snow and stared at her own house as if it had betrayed her. I can't do it, she said, and the words startled her with their flatness. I can't make Christmas dinner, Arthur. I can't. The turkey's frozen solid. There's bread dough consuming the kitchen. Every pot and pan has decided to start dancing. I can't. Her voice cracked on the last word. Molly hated tears. Tears made her feel helpless, and helpless was a luxury she had never allowed herself, not with 7 children, not with a house held together by love and stubborn magic. But she felt them rise anyway, hot and humiliating. Arthur's arm wrapped around her shoulders. He was warm and solid, smelling faintly of sleep and the ministry and home. It's all right, Molly, he said softly. It's not all right, Molly snapped, wiping fiercely at her eyes. They'll be here soon. Bill and Charlie tonight, George today, Percy tomorrow morning, Ron and Hermione and Harry, hopefully. What am I supposed to feed them? How am I supposed to make this special when I can't even boil water without the kettle running away? We'll figure something out, Arthur said, though his voice held less confidence than usual. We could go to the leaky cauldron, or... No, Molly said fiercely. She couldn't explain it properly, not in a neat sentence. She couldn't explain that Christmas dinner was not just food. It was her proof. It was her ritual. It was the way she held her family together and convinced herself that survival meant something, that the war hadn't broken them beyond repair, that if she could set a table and fill it, then maybe the empty chair would not feel quite so loud. She wanted it perfect, because perfection felt like protection. Arthur squeezed her hand. Come on, he said gently. George will be here soon. If anyone understands misbehaving magic, it's... He trailed off, because George might understand. George, who had built a joke shop with Fred. George, who knew the twins' experimental charms and prank enchantments. George, who was coming home today, and would walk into the Burrow expecting warmth, and find instead his mother defeated in the snow, and the kitchen staging a rebellion. George, Molly repeated, and hope flickered weakly in her chest. Yes, George. She drew a shaky breath, squared her shoulders, and turned back toward the house. Then the chickens began to cluck in alarm. Molly glanced over and saw why. A thick ribbon of bread dough had squeezed itself out through a small gap in the kitchen window and was now oozing across the garden path, leaving a trail like a pale slug. It moved slowly but steadily, as if the dough had decided it wanted to explore the world beyond the kitchen. Molly stared at it for one stunned second. Then she laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that startled even herself. Of course, she said, voice breaking. Of course it has escaped. Arthur, still holding her, looked at the dough trail and let out a helpless little breath of laughter too. It sounded more like disbelief than joy. We need a shovel, Arthur said. We need a miracle, Molly replied. They spent the next hour trying to herd dough back toward the house, using levitation charms and buckets. The dough resisted in an annoyingly determined way, swelling and wobbling as though it enjoyed being the center of attention. Molly felt ridiculous. Molly Weasley, survivor of wars and mother of 7, standing in the snow, wrestling bread. At one point, she found herself using a butterfly net she had pulled from the shed, the sort Ron used when he was small to chase gnomes. Arthur had suggested it with a straight face, as if this were perfectly reasonable. Molly did not have the energy to argue. By the time George arrived, she was covered in flour and streaked with dough. Her hair had escaped its bun and stuck out in wild angles. Her hands were cold and cramped from gripping buckets. Her patience was hanging by a thread. George came through the gate, whistling, carrying a carpet bag and a wrapped package that ticked faintly. He took in the scene and stopped mid-note. His bag dropped into the snow. "Mum," he called. "Dad, why is there bread dough everywhere?" Molly looked up, and relief hit her so hard her knees nearly gave out. "George," she said, and her voice held so much gratitude that George immediately abandoned his belongings and hurried toward them. "Oh, thank Merlin, you're here," Molly said. "The kitchen has gone mad." "Mad how?" George asked, though his eyes were already darting toward the house with nervous fascination. Arthur waved the butterfly net at a blob of dough, attempting to crawl toward the chicken coop. "Mad, as in everything, is moving on its own. The turkey won't thaw, the bread won't stop rising, and I think the teapot has opinions." George crouched and poked the nearest mound of dough. It quivered and expanded a little, as if offended by being treated like a sample. "Blimey," George murmured. "That's impressive." Molly gave him a look. "Right, sorry," George said quickly. "Hands up. I didn't mean impressive in a helpful way. I meant impressive in a terrifying way." His gaze flicked over the chaos with the sharp assessment of someone used to pranks and misbehaving magic. He looked at the dough trails, at the buckets, at Molly's flour-streaked face, at Arthur's resigned expression. Then something shifted in George's eyes. It was quick, a shadow of recognition, like a memory surfacing. Molly saw it instantly. "George," she said, voice sharpening. "What is it?" "Nothing," George replied too fast. "George Frederick Weasley," Molly said, and there was no warmth in the use of his full name, only the authority of a mother who had raised 7 children and could smell secrecy like smoke. George winced. His remaining ear turned slightly pink. "All right, fine," he said, shifting his weight. This is going to sound mad, but I had a thought, a memory. Something Fred mentioned ages ago. It can't possibly be related, but Molly's chest tightened at the name. "Fred." Arthur stepped closer, expression gentle but attentive. "What did he mention?" George swallowed. His voice lowered. "He talked once about enchanting the kitchen." George said slowly, "Years ago, before the war got as bad as it did. He'd been reading about sympathetic household magic, enchantments tied to objects people use every day. He said he wanted to do something nice for you, Mum." Molly went very still. "What kind of enchantment?" she asked. George shook his head. "I didn't know the details. He was secretive about it. Said it was a surprise. I assumed he either finished it and we never noticed, or he abandoned it when the shop got busy. And after he died, I didn't think about it again." The words caught slightly. George's eyes stayed fixed on the house, as if he could see through the walls. "There were so many half-finished projects," he said quietly. "So many things we never got to clean up. I couldn't look at most of it." Molly felt Arthur's hand find hers, fingers warm against her cold skin. "But if he did finish it," George continued, "and if it's been dormant, waiting for a trigger." "A trigger," Molly repeated, voice thin. "What trigger?" George exhaled slowly. "I don't know. Fred was always the one who thought in layers. He'd build a thing with conditions, like a puzzle box. But he documented everything. If this is his work, there'll be notes somewhere." "Where?" Arthur asked, soft. George hesitated. "His room, probably. Unless you cleared it out." Molly's answer came instantly, sharp and honest. No, she had cleaned around it, dusted shelves, changed sheets so they wouldn't yellow. But she had not packed anything away. She had not moved anything. The room was exactly as Fred left it, frozen in time. Part of her had told herself it was respect. Part of her had known it was something else. George nodded, understanding in his face. Right. Then I'll look. He started toward the house, then paused, glancing back at Molly. Mum, don't take this the wrong way, but maybe you should stay out here. If the kitchen's acting up because of Fred's magic, having more people inside might make it worse. Molly bristled at the suggestion, instinctively ready to argue. It was her house, her kitchen, her problem. But she was exhausted. She was cold, and she was, painfully, out of answers. She nodded once. Arthur guided her to the garden bench, the lopsided one he'd built years ago, and sat beside her. The winter sunlight was thin on the snow. Around them, the bread dough had finally slowed its aggressive expansion, forming strange pale sculptures across the garden like a ridiculous art exhibit. I just wanted Christmas to be perfect, Molly said quietly, staring at the house. I know, Arthur replied, but home isn't the food. It's us. Molly leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent of parchment and home. She wanted to argue. She wanted to insist that the food mattered because it was what she could control. But she was too tired to pretend she wasn't afraid. Inside, George's footsteps sounded on the stairs. Doors opened and closed. Drawers slid. The house creaked in response, like it was listening. Time stretched. 20 minutes. 30. Molly's worry grew sharp. She imagined George in Fred's room, touching his twins' things, looking through old notes, confronting memories that never softened. She imagined the quiet pain behind George's steady face. She hated that she couldn't protect him from it any more than she could protect herself. When George finally emerged, he held a single piece of parchment in his hand. It was covered in untidy scroll that Molly recognized immediately. Handwriting that belonged to laughter and trouble, and a boy who had once been all elbows and bright eyes. George's face was pale, but his eyes were bright, the way they used to look when the twins had figured out something clever. Found it, George said, voice rough. Mom, you're not going to believe this. Molly stood. Her legs felt strange and unsteady. She reached for the parchment with hands that trembled slightly. At the top, underlined repeatedly, it read, Project Christmas Miracle. Molly's breath caught hard enough it hurt. Beneath the title, Fred's handwriting ran in cramped notes and diagrams. The words felt like a voice she hadn't heard in years, alive on paper. Mum always tries to do everything herself. Every Christmas, every birthday, every bloody Tuesday, she works herself to exhaustion to make sure we're fed and happy. Time to fix that. Molly's vision blurred instantly. She blinked hard, but the words swam anyway. Household enchantment. Sympathetic magic tied to kitchen implements and ingredients. Goal. Make cooking easier when help is offered. Increasingly difficult when working alone. Gradual escalation to ensure safety. Nothing dangerous. Just increasingly absurd until the point is made. Activation trigger. Major family gathering at Christmas, when most family members are present at the Burrow. Key condition. Cooperation. Magic recognizes individual effort versus collaborative effort. Kitchen behaves properly only when family works together. Molly's throat tightened until she couldn't swallow. George spoke softly beside her. He wanted you to let us help, Mum. That was the whole point. The kitchen was designed to make it impossible for you to do everything alone. Molly couldn't speak. She pressed the parchment to her chest as if it were warm. It's all here, George continued, voice thick. Instructions, too. How to work with it. Tasks in pairs. shared decisions. It even adjusts based on who's helping. If someone can't cook, it gives them easier jobs. Arthur stared at the notes with wonder. He thought of everything. He always did, George whispered. Even after, even now. Molly drew a shaky breath. Grief and love and frustration and relief tangled inside her until she couldn't separate them. Fred had done this. Fred had woven something into the heart of her home. Not to mock her, not to make her life harder for the sake of it, but because he knew her too well. Because he knew she would never ask for help. Because he knew she would work herself into exhaustion and call it love, until one day she couldn't do it anymore. So he had created magic that would not allow her to do it alone. 3 years ago, he had built this. Then he had left it sleeping in the walls, waiting patiently for the exact conditions. Christmas, a family returning, Molly determined to handle it all herself, and the house full enough of anticipation that his enchantment could finally speak. You don't have to be alone. Molly lifted her head, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. All right, she said, voice hoarse. All right. George's expression flickered. Hope and sadness mixed together. We do it together, Molly continued, because she needed to say it clearly, out loud, like a vow. We cook together, all of us. But, she added, looking at the dough trails across the garden, someone is dealing with the bread first. George's grin flashed, familiar and bright despite everything missing. I've got an idea, he said. It's mad enough, Fred would approve. Arthur laughed, real laughter breaking through the tension. Your mother's going to hex you. Probably, George agreed cheerfully. But at least we'll all be together when she does. Molly took another breath and squared her shoulders. The fear was still there, but something else had slipped into its place. A strange, reluctant relief. A sense that the burden she had been carrying alone might actually be shared. They walked back towards the house together, 3 Weasleys facing down an enchanted kitchen, with nothing but each other and a dead boy's love written in messy ink to guide them. Inside, the Burrow waited. The copper pots hung still for the moment, but Molly could almost feel the hum beneath the walls, the quiet anticipation of magic that had finally been understood. The oven door swung once, gently, like a smile. George's idea for the bread dough, it turned out, involved 3 things Molly would never have placed in the same sentence on purpose. The chickens, a row of buckets, and the largest oven tray she owned. He marched back into the house, like a man returning to familiar territory, parchment in hand, eyes bright with that particular brand of focused mischief that had always meant trouble when he was 16 and meant solutions now that he was grown. Arthur followed at his shoulder, still in his nightshirt, already trying to read Fred's notes upside down as he walked. Molly came last, reluctant and weary, bracing herself for the sight of her kitchen. The moment she opened the door, warmth hit her face, thick with yeast and flour. The kitchen was louder than it should have been for an empty room. Not loud in the ordinary sense, but alive with motion. A soft clink here, a gentle scrape there, like utensils shifting when you weren't looking. The dough dominated the space. It covered half the floor in pale mounds, pressed against cabinet fronts, and stretched in thick folds up the table legs. The bowl it had come from looked tiny now, swallowed and irrelevant, sitting at the center of the original spill like the crater of a volcano after the eruption. The kettle was perched on the stovetop at a slight angle, as if pretending innocence. Molly inhaled through her nose, then exhaled slowly and stepped in. All right, she said, voice firm. All right, we're doing this together. George, what's the plan? George held up his hands. First, we stop treating it like a problem and start treating it like an ingredient. It is currently my flaw, Molly said flatly. Yes, but it's also bread, George replied, and there was a strange tenderness under the joke. Fred's notes say escalation is absurd, but safe. That means it's not dangerous. It's just insistent. So we give it something to do. Arthur blinked. Give the dough something to do. George nodded as if this was obvious. Chickens. Chickens love dough. But we don't want them eating half the kitchen and laying horrifying eggs for the next month. So we portion it into manageable lumps, move it outside, let them peck at it for a bit. Then we bake what's left into emergency rolls. Molly stared at him. Arthur's eyes lit up. That's brilliant. Of course you think it's brilliant, Molly muttered. George grinned. Thank you, Mom. Molly took Fred's parchment from him, held it close to the light, and scanned the lines again. The notes weren't just theory. Fred had written practical instructions in the margins, little arrows pointing to phrases like, if it gets out of hand, and Mom will definitely try to fight it. So prepare for that. There was even a section labeled, if Mum is fuming. Molly's mouth tightened. She could almost hear Fred's laugh in the back of her mind, delighted and sure of himself. All right, Molly said again, and this time she aimed the words at herself as much as the room. We portion it. George, you take the left side. Arthur, you take the right. I'll handle the center around the table. Arthur rolled up his sleeves enthusiastically. He did not appear bothered by being ankle-deep in dough. Arthur had always treated mess like evidence of life rather than inconvenience. Molly wished briefly that she could do the same. They stepped into the dough together. It responded immediately, not by attacking, not by swelling again, but by shifting, almost helping. The thickest mound near the pantry door softened and sagged slightly as Arthur approached, as if making room. A ribbon that had been climbing the wall loosened and drooped like a tired arm. Even the table leg tendril stopped its slow ascent and fell away, settling onto the floor in a compliant lump. Molly's breath caught. The room felt different, less hostile, as if it noticed they were no longer one person fighting alone. George noticed too. He glanced up at Molly with wide eyes. See, he whispered, it's reacting already. Molly didn't trust herself to speak. She lifted her wand and performed a simple slicing charm to divide a mound into 3 portions. The dough separated cleanly and, importantly, did not multiply. It simply sat there, puffy and obedient, as if waiting for instructions. Well, Molly said in a tight voice, that's something. Arthur laughed softly. It's working, Molly. It's working. They scooped lumps into buckets. The dough no longer resisted. It didn't cling as stubbornly to their hands. It didn't creep. It behaved like ordinary bread dough, if ordinary bread dough could be measured in bucketfuls. George opened the back door and began hauling buckets outside. Molly followed with the next, then Arthur with the next, and soon they had formed a small procession. In, scoop, out, dump into a large tray lined with parchment. Repeat. The kitchen utensils, as if disappointed by the sudden lack of drama, quieted. A saucepan lid that had been spinning lazily stopped and settled itself on the pot where it belonged. Wooden spoons sank back into their crock, slumped like conductors called off stage. When they carried the last bucket outside, the garden felt startlingly peaceful in comparison. Snow muffled the world. The chickens watched them with that blank, judgmental interest chickens always seem to have, heads tilting in synchronized curiosity. George set the trays down near the coop. Right, chickens, you've got 5 minutes to do what you do best. Molly stared. You're going to let them eat it. George shrugged. If they want to help, let them help. That's the theme, isn't it? Arthur opened his mouth to say something about how fascinating it was that chickens could be enlisted in holiday magic, but Molly cut him off with a look. Fine, Molly said. 5 minutes. Then we bake whatever's left, and then we are done with bread. Done. The chickens did not need encouragement. They descended on the dough lumps with enthusiasm, pecking and tugging, flinging small bits into the snow. It was messy. It was ridiculous. Molly watched, half horrified and half amused despite herself. George nudged her shoulder gently. Fred would have loved this, he said. Molly's throat tightened. Yes, she managed. They returned inside while the chickens did their work. The kitchen looked less like a disaster now. Still messy, flour everywhere, smears of dough on cabinet fronts. But the floor was mostly visible again. The air felt lighter. Then Molly remembered the pantry and her stomach dropped. The turkey. She hurried to the pantry door and pulled it open. The turkey was still there, still frozen solid, frost glittering under the larder's light. She lifted her wand, tried a thawing charm again out of spite. Nothing. George came up behind her, quiet now. Right. Turkey. Arthur leaned in, squinting at it, as if the problem could be solved by staring hard enough. That's definitely magical freezing, he said thoughtfully. Not just cold storage. George flipped through Fred's parchment. There's a section here about stubborn proteins, he said, and Molly could tell from his tone that he was trying not to smile at Fred's phrasing. He wrote down a counter method, but it requires two people casting at once. One to disrupt the freezing enchantment, and one to create a warming field. Arthur's eyes brightened. That sounds like tandem spell work. Bill does that sort of thing all the time. Molly swallowed. Bill wasn't here yet. Charlie wasn't here yet. Percy wasn't here yet. Ron wasn't here yet. And the kitchen was already making its point. If the magic truly required family, perhaps it was waiting for more than 3 Weasleys. Or perhaps, Molly thought bitterly, it was simply enjoying itself. We can try it, Arthur said immediately. George nodded. I can do one side, you do the other. Mum, you supervise. I do not supervise, Molly snapped automatically, then caught herself. She rubbed her forehead. Fine. I supervise. They positioned themselves in the pantry. Arthur on one side, George on the other, Molly between them, parchment in hand like a battle manual. George read Fred's instructions aloud, voice careful and steady. On 3, he said, Arthur, you disrupt the freezing charm. I'll cast the warming field. We need to hit it at the same moment. Arthur raised his wand, face earnest. Ready. George counted. 1, 2, 3. 2 spells flew simultaneously. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the frost along the turkey's skin shimmered, like ice catching sunlight. The temperature in the pantry shifted. The air warmed slightly. Molly held her breath. The turkey made a sound, not a real sound, a sort of creak, like a plank of wood expanding. A thin crack formed along one edge of the ice coating it, spreading like a spiderweb. Then the frost began to melt, slow at first, then faster, dripping into the tray beneath. Arthur let out an excited gasp. It's working. George's jaw clenched with concentration. Keep steady, Dad. Keep steady. Molly watched the ice retreat, watched color return to the turkey's skin, watched the stiffness fade. The thaw wasn't dramatic. It didn't burst or explode. It simply yielded, as though the turkey had finally accepted it was allowed to be food again. After a full minute, George dropped his wand arm with a shaky breath. Arthur did the same. They stared. The turkey was no longer frozen solid. Molly reached out, pressed a fingertip gently against the skin. It gave slightly under her touch. She nearly sagged with relief. Oh, she began, then stopped, because the words caught. Arthur beamed. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Fred's notes are extraordinary. George's face softened, grief and pride tangled together. He always wrote everything down like a maniac, George murmured. Drove me mad. Now I'm grateful. Molly swallowed hard. All right, she said briskly, because if she lingered on the feeling, she would cry again. We brine it. Now, Before something else decides to, she didn't finish, because the kettle chose that exact moment to hop once on the stovetop, like a child reminding them it existed. George pointed his wand at it. Behave, he warned. The kettle stilled. Arthur laughed. It's like the kitchen's listening. It is listening, Molly said, and she didn't know whether that frightened her or comforted her. They returned to the main room and began setting up the brine. Molly fetched the largest container: salt, sugar, herbs, aromatics. Arthur filled it with water. George chopped garlic and crushed peppercorns. They worked side by side in a way Molly hadn't realized she'd been avoiding. She always did the brine alone. She always did everything alone. Now the work moved faster, smoother, less strained, and the kitchen, for the first time that morning, stopped fighting them. The flame under the pot behaved. The spoon stirred normally. The sink drained without gurgling insults. Even the cupboard door where the cooling rack hid stayed shut without rattling. Molly felt something in her chest loosen, painfully, like a knot she'd been carrying for years and hadn't known how to untie. Outside, the chickens made triumphant sounds. George went to check and returned with the trays. The dough was reduced, messy, pecked, uneven, but still usable. He scraped what remained into a bowl with cheerful determination. Emergency rolls, he announced. Ugly, but edible. Molly opened her mouth to protest, then closed it. Ugly was fine. Ugly was honest. Ugly was alive. She set the oven, watched the temperature gauge swing once, then settle. It behaved, almost as if satisfied. They baked the rolls quickly. They came out lopsided and different sizes, some too pale, some too dark, but they smelled like bread and warmth. Molly covered them with a towel and let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time all morning, the kitchen was quiet. Not silent, exactly. The Burrow never truly went silent, but the aggressive chaos had faded. The room felt attentive, waiting, like a dog that had made its point and was now sitting politely to see what you would do next. Molly wiped her hands on her apron and looked at Fred's parchment again. The words at the bottom of the page caught her eye, written smaller, half hidden beneath a diagram of the kitchen layout. Note to self. Mum will try to do everything anyway. Mum always does. Escalate until she's forced to accept help. Nothing dangerous, just ridiculous. The point is love. The point is family. Molly's throat tightened. She pressed her thumb over the ink, as if touching it could touch him. George noticed. He went quiet beside her. He wanted you to rest, George said softly. He wanted you to know we want to do it with you, not just eat what you make. Molly blinked hard. I know, she whispered. Then, as if the house itself had heard that admission, the Weasley clock in the corner ticked sharply. Molly looked up. George's hand, George's pointer, shifted. It moved from Diagon Alley toward home, hovering, as if the Burrow recognized his presence properly now that he had stepped into the enchantment, and understood it. Arthur's hand shifted too, edging closer, like it was eager to return. And then, slowly, another hand twitched. Bill's. Still far away, still traveling, but angled slightly as though the very idea of home had begun to pull him. Molly's breath caught. They'll be here soon, she said, voice barely audible. George nodded. Soon. Molly looked around her kitchen. The pots hung still. The wooden spoons sat quietly in their crock. The oven door remained shut. The kettle did not move. The room was behaving, but Molly could feel the hum beneath it, the magic woven into the walls like thread. It was waiting for more. It was waiting for the house to fill. And Molly understood, with a strange mixture of dread and relief, that this was only the beginning. Because Bill and Charlie would arrive tonight. Percy tomorrow. Ron, Hermione, Harry. Ginny, the cousins, the friends. The Burrow would become what it always became at Christmas. Crowded, noisy, imperfect. And Fred's enchantment, now awake, would make sure no one tried to carry the weight alone again. Molly straightened her shoulders. "All right," she said, and for the first time the words didn't feel like a command aimed at the world. They felt like a decision made inside her. "All right, we'll do it properly. Together." Just then, from the front garden, came the faint squeak of the gate. Molly's head snapped up. Someone was arriving. The squeak of the garden gate cut through the kitchen's uneasy quiet like a pin through fabric. Molly's head lifted so sharply her neck twinged. For one brief second, she thought it might be Bill and Charlie arriving early, or Percy turning up ahead of schedule in some rare burst of enthusiasm. But then she heard the familiar cadence of footsteps. Light, quick, careful, accompanied by the faint clink of something metal in a pocket. George looked toward the back window. "Not Bill," he said, voice too casual. "Their steps are heavier." Molly moved to the window and peered through the glass. A figure in a thick cloak was coming up the garden path, breath misting in the cold air, carrying a small satchel and a rectangular bundle tucked under one arm. The bundle was wrapped in brown paper and sealed with red wax, and the seal glittered faintly with magic even from this distance. Molly squinted. The cloak was familiar. George's face shifted before Molly could place it. He let out a soft, incredulous laugh. "Oh, brilliant," he said. "Of course." "Who?" Molly demanded, already half certain she would be annoyed. The front door opened before George could answer, and a voice drifted in, cheerful and slightly strained with cold. "Hello? Anyone home?" I could hear something from the garden. Molly closed her eyes for a moment, as if the universe itself had conspired to test her patience. Then she opened them, wiped her hands quickly on her apron, and marched towards the hallway. Percy Weasley stood just inside the doorway. He looked as if he had been on his way somewhere respectable and had taken a wrong turn into chaos. His robes were neat. His hair was carefully combed. His ministry badge gleamed on his chest, even though it was Christmas Eve. Snow clung to the hems of his cloak. His cheeks were pink from cold and embarrassment. Behind him, Audrey hovered with a tentative smile, clutching a parcel that smelled faintly of baked goods and cinnamon. Percy's eyes flicked from Molly to Arthur to George, taking in flour streaks and stray dough on sleeves, and the general look of a household that had been wrestling its own kitchen. "Mother," Percy said carefully, as if the wrong word might cause something to explode. We. I know we said tomorrow. But Audrey's parents wanted us for lunch, and then it turned out we could leave earlier, and Percy's gaze slid past Molly's shoulder into the kitchen. He paused mid-sentence. The kitchen was, at the moment, behaving, but it still looked like a battlefield. Flour dust in the air, a smear of dough on a cabinet door, buckets near the back entrance, the emergency rolls under a tea towel, a stack of bowls that looked as if they had been reassembled slightly out of order. Percy stared for a moment, too long, then cleared his throat. "Is that bread?" he asked, as if he was trying to sound normal. "It's many things," George replied. Mostly an insult. But yes, bread. Audrey's eyes widened, not in fear, but in the cautious fascination of someone who had married into the Weasley family and had slowly learned that the word normal did not apply in this house. She took a small step forward, still holding her parcel like a shield. "Hello, Mrs. Weasley," she said softly. Percy thought it might help if we came early." Molly felt something tighten and then loosen again in her chest. Percy, coming early. Percy, who had spent years holding the family at arm's length, turning up without being begged, without being guilted, without being coaxed. Molly's first instinct was to fuss, to ask if they'd eaten. To tell Percy he should have written, to demand why he was still wearing his ministry badge, to insist Audrey take off her cloak or she'd catch cold. Instead, she did something that surprised even her. She stepped forward and hugged Percy. It was awkward. Percy stiffened instantly, arms half raised as if he didn't know what to do with them. Then his posture softened a fraction, and he let himself lean into her, just slightly, like a man remembering he was still allowed to be someone's son. "Merry Christmas Eve," Molly said, voice thick. Percy swallowed. "Merry Christmas, Mother." She pulled back and turned to Audrey, and hugged her too, because if Audrey had been part of the reason Percy was here, then Audrey deserved the warmth as much as anyone. "Come in," Molly said briskly, as if briskness could hide emotion. "It's freezing out there. And mind the, well, there's not dough on the floor anymore, but I'm not making promises about the rest of the house." Percy stepped into the kitchen with the cautious gait of a man entering uncertain territory. He glanced around again, taking in the mess, the buckets, the lingering flour. His eyes landed on the turkey container in the cold larder, brine shimmering faintly. "Mother," Percy said, and there was genuine concern in his voice now. "What has happened?" George answered before Molly could. "Fred happened," he said simply. Percy's face changed. Not dramatically. Percy was not dramatic. But something shifted around his eyes. A softening, a pain that was always there, but usually held behind careful walls. George held up Fred's parchment. He enchanted the kitchen years ago, designed it to misbehave if Mum tries to do everything alone. It activated now because everyone's coming home for Christmas. Percy stared at the parchment as if it were both impossible and deeply familiar. Then, slowly, he stepped closer and took it gently from George's hands. His fingers traced the title at the top, Project Christmas Miracle. Percy's throat worked as he swallowed. "That is so like him," Percy said quietly, voice controlled but not cold. "Ridiculous, excessive, and somehow well-intentioned." Molly blinked hard. Percy handing Fred's notes like something sacred. Percy saying well-intentioned about the brother he had once rolled his eyes at, once refused to listen to, once dismissed. Audrey stepped beside Percy and glanced at the parchment. Tears gathered in her eyes immediately, the kind that arrived when grief was shared rather than carried alone. "It's sweet," she murmured. Percy cleared his throat again, then very carefully folded the parchment and handed it back to George, as if acknowledging that George was the keeper of this particular piece of Fred. "Right," Percy said, slipping into practical tone like a shield. "What needs to be done?" Molly opened her mouth with the old instinct to say everything, to begin giving orders, to outline schedules and tasks, and exact timings. But she felt the kitchen's hum beneath the floorboards, attentive, listening. And she heard Fred's notes in her head like a voice. No one does anything alone. So Molly did something else. She exhaled, then she said evenly, "We need help. All of it. The turkey is brining now, thank Merlin. But we still have vegetables to prep. Bread sauce base, final mince pies if we want extra. And the pudding needs reheating tomorrow. Also, the kitchen might react if someone tries to take over alone." Percy's eyes flicked up. "You mean it will misbehave if you do too much by yourself?" "Yes," Molly said, and her voice carried equal parts irritation and reluctant acceptance. Percy looked thoughtful, and then something almost like humor touched his mouth. "A sensible safeguard," he said. In its own lunatic way, George made a sound that might have been a laugh and a choke at the same time. Audrey raised her parcel. "I brought something," she said. "My mother insisted. Mince pies, actually. Her recipe." Molly's eyebrows lifted. Audrey's mother was serious about her baking. Molly had heard stories. Audrey's mother and her Christmas spread were apparently legendary in their own right. "Oh," Molly said, and meant it. "Thank you, dear. Put them on the table." We'll need them. We always need more mince pies than we think. Percy was already rolling up his sleeves, which startled Molly again, because Percy in rolled-up sleeves felt like a rare sight, like seeing a portrait smile unexpectedly. If we're doing this properly, Percy said, then we should assign tasks in pairs. That seems consistent with the enchantment's requirements. Arthur looked delighted. Percy, my boy, that's exactly right. Percy flinched slightly at the affection in Arthur's tone, then relaxed. He looked around as if assessing the kitchen like a ministry problem. All right, Percy said. Audrey, you and I can take vegetables. George, you and Mother take pastry or sauces. Father can assist wherever needed. Molly stared at Percy. He was organizing her kitchen like it was a department. But the bizarre thing was, it felt helpful. The kitchen, too, seemed to approve. A wooden spoon in the crock shifted and angled itself toward Percy, as if offering service. Percy noticed and froze for half a second, eyes narrowing. Did that spoon just? Yes, George said. Get used to it. They're very opinionated. Percy inhaled slowly, and then, in a rare moment of surrender, said, Fine, I will not argue with a spoon. Audrey laughed softly, the sound warm and surprised. Molly felt something in her chest ease again. This wasn't her perfect plan. This was something else. Something shared. They began. Audrey and Percy took the vegetable station near the sink. Percy's technique was meticulous, precise, as if he were drafting a report in the form of chopped parsnips. Audrey's hands were quicker, more fluid, and she gently teased Percy into moving faster. You don't have to make every slice identical, Percy, she said, smiling. I do, Percy replied automatically. Audrey raised an eyebrow. To you. Percy hesitated, glanced at the kitchen as if it might judge him, then said, No, but I prefer it. George and Molly tackled sauces together. Molly measured ingredients for bread sauce base, while George stirred, and the spoon behaved itself, moving exactly as directed. Molly felt an odd jolt of satisfaction at that simple cooperation, like the kitchen was rewarding them for doing it the way Fred wanted. Arthur drifted between stations, refilling water, fetching ingredients, trying not to get underfoot, and failing occasionally. Yet even his chaos felt gentler now, purposeful. At one point, the kettle hopped once on the stovetop, and Arthur pointed his wand at it and said firmly, No. The kettle stilled. Percy watched this with a look of quiet disbelief and murmured, This is the strangest family tradition I have ever seen. George, without looking up, said, Give it an hour. It'll get worse. Molly should have been annoyed by that. Instead, she found herself snorting a small laugh. It got worse. Not in a dangerous way. Fred had promised safety, and the kitchen at least seemed committed to that. But it got more absurd, like the house wanted to prove it could still embarrass them if they got too comfortable. When Percy tried to chop potatoes alone for a moment, while Audrey went to wash her hands, the peeler skittered away and hid itself behind the sugar jar. Percy stared at it, as if the peeler had insulted him personally. George watched, amused. Kitchen's telling you off, Percy. Percy lifted his wand. Accio peeler. The peeler shot toward him so fast it smacked into his palm with a little sting. Percy's lips thinned. Rude. Molly pointed with her spoon. Audrey has to be here with you, Percy. Pears. Percy inhaled sharply through his nose, then said, Fine. The moment Audrey returned, the peeler behaved. A saucepan lid attempted to wear itself as a hat on Arthur's head. Arthur let it, laughing until Molly removed it with a flick and told him to stop encouraging the cookware. The wooden spoons conducted once, briefly, waving as if leading an invisible orchestra. But instead of chaos, it felt like celebration, a flourish of nonsense. Then quiet again, and then, as afternoon light began to thin, the garden gate squeaked again. This time, the footsteps were heavier, Molly turned toward the window and felt her heart lift and tighten all at once. Bill. Bill came through the gate first, tall and solid, hair tied back, breath misting in the cold. Fleur followed, elegant even in winter travel robes, Victoire bundled against her chest. Behind them, Charlie strode in with long, confident steps, cheeks wine-reddened, hair longer than Molly remembered, carrying a battered duffel that looked as if it had survived Dragon Camp by sheer stubbornness. The sight of them hit Molly like warmth. Bill reached the door and pushed it open, and the sound of the burrow's interior spilled out. Voices, clinks, laughter, the hum of cooking. Bill stepped inside and stopped. He blinked once, took in Percy chopping vegetables in rolled sleeves, Audrey laughing softly, Arthur wearing a saucepan lid like an accidental crown, George stirring bread sauce with an expression of serious focus, and Molly standing at the center of it all, with flour on her apron and eyes that were far too bright. Bill's mouth curved into a slow smile. "Mum," he said, and there was affection and something like awe in his voice. "What, in the name of Merlin, is happening?" Charlie leaned in behind him, saw the same scene, and barked a laugh. "Is that Percy chopping parsnips?" Charlie demanded, as if Percy had been spotted doing something illegal. Percy's ears went pink. "I am perfectly capable of chopping parsnips," he said stiffly. Fleur stepped into the kitchen and surveyed it with wide, silvery eyes. Her gaze landed on a wooden spoon that was swaying gently, as if greeting her. Fleur blinked, then smiled faintly. "This house," she murmured. "It is very alive." Victoire wriggled in her arms and pointed at Arthur's saucepan hat with delighted fascination. "Papa," she said, because Victoire called everyone Papa if they looked warm enough. Arthur beamed. "Hello there, Victoire. I've been practicing my hat collection just for you." Molly moved then, pushing past the table, past bowls and parchment and the scent of spices, and wrapped her arms around Bill so tightly she felt his ribs press under her hands. "Oh, Bill," she said into his shoulder. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here." Bill hugged her back just as tightly. His voice was softer when he said, "Me too, Mum." Charlie hugged her next, nearly lifting her off her feet the way he used to when he was younger. Molly scolded him automatically, then hugged him again because she couldn't help it. Fleur stepped forward and kissed Molly's cheeks, then offered Victoire, who reached for Molly's hair, and grabbed a handful with surprising strength. "Ow, Victoire, darling," Molly said, laughing through the sting. And for a moment the kitchen, the house, the world felt like it had remembered how to be. George cleared his throat. "Right. Explanation. Fred," he said, holding up the parchment like evidence in court. "Fred enchanted the kitchen years ago to misbehave if Mum tries to do everything alone. It triggered because everyone's coming home." Bill's expression shifted, softening. He took in the parchment without touching it yet, like it might burn. Charlie's smile faded into something quieter. "Of course he did," Charlie said, voice thick. "Of course the git did." Percy swallowed. "It's actually rather clever," Percy said. And George looked at him sharply, because praise from Percy about Fred was still rare enough to feel like a small miracle. Bill finally reached for the parchment and read quickly, eyes scanning. His jaw tightened slightly at certain lines, the kind of tightening Molly recognized from Bill's curse-breaking work, a sign of emotion being contained rather than shown. "He wanted you to let us help," Bill said quietly when he finished, voice steady. "That's what this is." Molly nodded, unable to speak properly. Fleur, still holding Victoire again, looked around the kitchen with understanding dawning. "So the magic, it wants everyone to work together?" George nodded. "Exactly. No solo missions." Charlie slapped his hands together. "Right then. What needs doing?" Molly's old instinct surged. To assign, to control, to direct. But she caught herself, felt the kitchen's hum, felt Fred's enchantment like a hand at her back. "We keep cooking," Molly said. "Together." She turned to Bill and Charlie. "We've started vegetables and sauces. The turkey is brining. We'll need pastries later. And tomorrow we'll roast and finish everything. But right now we need to keep the kitchen cooperative, which apparently means no one works alone." Bill rolled up his sleeves. "Put me wherever you need me." Charlie already had a knife in hand, because Charlie could find a knife in any kitchen in under 2 seconds. "Vegetables," he said. "I'm good at chopping things. Professionally." George pointed at him. "Audrey and Percy have the vegetable station. Join them." Charlie grinned and slid in beside Percy with the ease of a brother who had never cared about personal space. Percy stiffened. "Charlie," Percy said, trying for stern and landing somewhere around resigned, "do not treat my parsnips like dragon feed." Charlie winked. No promises. Bill moved to Molly's side without waiting for instruction and began fetching ingredients as she spoke. He moved like someone used to working under pressure, efficient, calm, and quietly attentive to everyone around him. Molly felt her chest tighten again, but this time the feeling was gratitude rather than fear. Fleur stepped to the pastry side and began examining the flour and butter with an expression that suggested she was about to take the entire concept of mince pies personally. She set Victoire in a charmed high chair, and Victoire immediately began banging a wooden spoon on the tray like a tiny percussionist. The wooden spoons in the crock swayed in response, as if acknowledging a fellow musician. "Oh no," George murmured. "The spoons are bonding." Arthur clapped his hands once. "This is wonderful," he declared, and then caught Molly's look and amended, "This is wonderful and also slightly terrifying." The kitchen filled, not just with people but with sound. Voices layered, laughs, sharp instructions, the scrape of knives, the clink of pans, the hiss of flame beneath pots. The burrow itself seemed to brighten, as if more bodies meant more warmth, more magic, more life. And the kitchen behaved. It did not skitter utensils away. It did not reverse spoons. It did not levitate trays. It hummed contentedly, like a creature finally being fed what it wanted. Cooperation. Molly found herself standing at the center of it, not directing like a general anymore, but moving with the flow, sharing tasks, passing bowls, letting Bill taste a sauce and adjust it without feeling insulted, letting Fleur take over pastry without feeling challenged, letting Charlie laugh at Percy's seriousness without stepping in to referee. It felt strange, like learning to walk a new way, but it also felt lighter. Bill leaned close as Molly stirred a pot. "You all right, Mum?" he asked quietly. Molly nodded, though her throat ached. "I'm fine," she lied automatically. Bill's eyes softened. "You don't have to be fine," he said. "You just have to be here." Molly blinked quickly before anyone could see tears. "I am here," she said. Bill squeezed her shoulder and went back to work. At the vegetable station, Charlie began singing something nonsensical about parsnips. George joined in from across the room, harmonizing badly on purpose. Audrey laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. Percy tried to protest and failed, though Molly saw the corner of his mouth twitch as if he was fighting a smile and losing. Fleur worked pastry with fierce concentration. She muttered in French as she crimped edges and folded dough. Victoire watched with wide eyes, then began patting her hands on the high chair tray. Like applause. Arthur leaned near Victoire and whispered, "Very good. Yes, excellent technique," which made Victoire giggle and then try to bite the spoon. The kitchen spoons conducted once more a brief flourish, as if cheering. Molly would have scolded them yesterday. Today she found herself smiling. And somewhere, under the laughter and the clink of pans, she felt it. The presence of something familiar in the walls. Not a ghost, not an apparition. Something quieter. A handprint in magic. A boy's stubborn love that had refused to disappear. Fred. Molly's eyes stung again, and she kept stirring because she had learned, finally, that sometimes you could keep moving and still feel everything. Later, when the first round of work was done, and the kitchen had been tidied into something resembling order, Bill and Charlie carried their bags upstairs. Fleur followed with Victoire, and Percy and Audrey retreated to the sitting room for tea. Arthur began banking the fire. Molly lingered in the kitchen doorway for a moment, alone at last, breathing in the scent of spices and pastry and the faint sharpness of brine. George came back in quietly and leaned against the counter, watching her. "You did it," he said softly. Molly frowned. "Did what?" "You let us help," George said, voice gentle. "Properly. You didn't fight it. Not the whole time." Molly's throat tightened. "I fought it a bit." George shrugged. "Your mum. Fighting is how you show love. But you let us stay anyway." Molly looked around her kitchen. It was messy, not disastrously, but lived in. Flour dusted the floor. A bowl sat half-washed by the sink. A spoon rested at an angle in the crock, like it was tired after conducting. And yet, everything felt right. It wasn't perfect. It was real. "We still have tomorrow," Molly said quietly. George grinned. "Oh, tomorrow will be absolute chaos. Ron hasn't even arrived yet, and you know he'll try to eat half the roast potatoes before they reach the table." Molly snorted. "And Hermione will try to organize everyone into a system, and Harry will hover like he doesn't belong until you rope him into stirring something, and then the kitchen will adore him," George said. Molly's breath caught slightly at that, because it felt true. Because the Weasleys had always pulled Harry in by force of love and habit, and Fred's magic would likely do the same. George's gaze dropped to Fred's parchment where it lay on the table. He touched it lightly, like he couldn't help himself. "I'm glad it triggered," George said, and his voice shook just a fraction. "I hate that it had to, but Mum, it feels like he's here." Molly swallowed. "He is," she said fiercely, "in this, in us." George nodded once, then straightened. "Right. Enough being emotional. We should probably make sure the kitchen doesn't decide to do anything dramatic overnight again." Molly shot him a look. "Don't say things like that." George held up his hands. "Sorry. Superstition." "Got it." They moved through the kitchen together, checking cupboards, covering bowls, ensuring the brine container was sealed, setting the emergency rolls aside. Molly noticed, with strange warmth, that George moved through the space like he belonged there again. Like the Burrow was not just his mother's house, but his home. Before heading upstairs, Molly paused by the utensil crock. The wooden spoons stood quietly now, orderly, almost innocent. "Thank you," she whispered, and meant it more broadly than the spoons. A spoon shifted slightly as if acknowledging her. Molly turned off the lights. Upstairs, the house was full. Not everyone yet. Not the whole family, but enough that the Burrow felt awake in the best way. Voices drifted down from the rooms, Bill laughing softly, Charlie thumping something into place, Fleur humming to Victoire, Percy speaking in low tones to Audrey, more relaxed than Molly had heard him in years. Molly climbed into bed beside Arthur, who reached for her hand automatically. "You're quiet," Arthur murmured. "Just tired," Molly said. Arthur squeezed her fingers. "Good tired," he said. Molly let her eyes close. Downstairs, in the dark kitchen, the Burrow hummed contentedly. Pots hung still. The kettle did not move. The oven door stayed shut. But the magic in the walls remained awake, patient, pleased. Tomorrow would bring more people, more hands, more laughter, more mess. And the kitchen would make sure none of them tried to do it alone again. Christmas morning arrived, the way it always did at the Burrow. Too early, too bright, and somehow louder than it had any right to be before sunrise. Molly woke first out of habit, eyes opening in the dim before dawn, her mind already running through timings and trays and temperatures before she could stop it. For a moment, that old panic tried to rise again, sharp and familiar. The urge to slip out of bed quietly, to get downstairs before anyone else, to reclaim control and make everything perfect while the house still slept. She lay very still and listened instead. Arthur's breathing was even beside her, warm and steady. From the room down the hall came the faint creak of a bed and the soft patter of small feet. Victoire, probably, awake and determined to explore. Then a low murmur in French that could only be Fleur, coaxing her back toward warmth. The burrow itself creaked gently, settling under the weight of bodies, full bodies. The kind of weight that didn't strain the house at all, only made it feel right. Molly swallowed and forced her hands to unclench under the covers. Not alone, she reminded herself, because the words mattered. Not today. She turned her head slightly and looked at Arthur in the dim. His hair stuck up at one side, his face relaxed in sleep, and there was something about him that always made Molly feel both softer and stronger at the same time. She reached out and touched his shoulder lightly. "Arthur," she whispered. He blinked awake slowly, then smiled sleepily, as if waking to her voice was the most normal thing in the world. "Morning, love." "Merry Christmas," Molly said. Arthur's smile broadened. "Merry Christmas." He squinted at the window. "Still dark." "It will be light soon," Molly said. And she felt that familiar itch again, the need to move, to start. Then she inhaled and added, "But we can wait a minute." Arthur looked at her properly then, as if he understood exactly what that sentence cost her. He didn't tease. He didn't make a joke. He simply reached for her hand and squeezed it. "We'll do it together," he said softly. Molly nodded once, and then she got up. Downstairs, the kitchen greeted her with a stillness that felt almost reverent. Frost painted intricate patterns on the window glass, turning the outside world into lace. The low winter sun was just beginning to turn the sky pale, and in the half-light the copper pots hanging above the cooker looked like pools of gold. The turkey was still in its brine in the cold larder, ready for the final preparation. The vegetables were prepped in neat bowls, covered and waiting. Trays were stacked in sensible piles. Someone had even set out the serving dishes last night, which Molly suspected had been Bill's quiet doing, because Bill always did things like that, without announcing them. The kitchen did not misbehave. The kettle sat where it should. The oven door remained shut. The wooden spoons stood in their crock like innocent soldiers. Molly could still feel the hum of magic under everything, awake and watchful. But it wasn't aggressive. It was waiting. Molly set the kettle on the stove, half expecting it to skitter away, but it stayed put. She flicked her wand and lit the flame. It took politely, a steady blue warmth. "Progress," Molly muttered. A soft footstep behind her made her turn, and she found George standing in the doorway, hair mussed, eyes already alert. He looked as though he'd been awake for a while, like sleep had never quite come easily to him on nights when Fred would have been laughing beside him. "Merry Christmas, Mum," George said. "Merry Christmas, darling," Molly replied, and she surprised herself by stepping forward and hugging him hard enough that he let out a small grunt. All right," George said, but he hugged her back just as tight. "Love you too." He pulled away, glanced at the kitchen, then lifted his brows. "It's behaving." "So far," Molly said cautiously. George's mouth twitched. "We'll see what happens when Ron arrives." "Ron isn't even here yet," Molly reminded him, and her tone was stern. But the thought of Ron barreling in with half his own weight in presence and twice that in appetite made warmth curl through her chest. As if summoned by the mention of more family, the stairs creaked, and Charlie appeared, hair sticking up in every direction, wearing an old jumper that looked like it had once been green and now existed in a vague state of threadbare determination. "Morning," Charlie mumbled, making a beeline for the kettle as if tea was oxygen. George pointed at him. "You're not allowed to do tea alone. Rules." Charlie blinked, then looked mildly offended. "I can do tea. Not the point," George said, already moving toward the cupboard. "Here, I'll get cups. You're supervised." Charlie snorted. "Supervised? By you?" "Yes," George said brightly. "By me. It's a Christmas miracle." Charlie grinned despite himself, and Molly's heart did a strange, painful twist at the sight of it, because Charlie's grin was so like Fred's sometimes, all teeth and mischief, and because George's grin had always been the same shape, but now carried a shadow in it. Bill arrived next, already dressed, hair tied back, looking entirely too composed for a man who had slept in the Burrow. He paused in the doorway, took in the scene. Molly at the kettle, George rummaging for cups, Charlie pretending not to need supervision, and his eyes softened. "Morning, Mum," Bill said. "Morning, Bill." Molly tried to sound brisk, normal. Then her voice betrayed her and came out thick. "You slept all right." Bill's smile was gentle. "Like a rock," he said, which was a lie, because Bill never slept like a rock on nights he was home. Bill slept with one ear open, out of habit and fear and responsibility. But Molly didn't call him on it. She simply nodded and pretended to accept it, because that was love too. Fleur drifted in behind Bill, Victoire balanced on her hip, both of them looking impossibly elegant, even at dawn. Victoire's hair stuck up in little tufts, and she blinked sleepily at the kitchen before spotting George and squealing with delighted recognition. "Uncle George," she announced, which was as close as Victoire had gotten to George's name so far. George's face lit up. "That's me. That's Uncle George," he said, and pulled a ridiculous face that made Victoire giggle. Fleur's eyes swept the kitchen. "This room," she said softly. "It is calm today." "It had better stay calm," Molly muttered, and Fleur smiled at her with a look that suggested she understood more than Molly wanted to admit. Soon after, Percy appeared, fully dressed, as if he had dressed for a ministry meeting rather than Christmas morning. He paused when he saw George holding Victoire's spoon like it was a microphone and conducting an imaginary orchestra with it. Percy stared. George glanced up. "Morning, Percy." Percy cleared his throat. "Merry Christmas." Audrey followed Percy in, smiling warmly, hair pinned back, sleeves already rolled as if she was prepared to cook before anyone even asked. "Merry Christmas, Mrs. Weasley," she said, and then she leaned down to kiss Molly's cheek in a way that was affectionate rather than polite. Molly felt an odd swell of gratitude for that small thing. "Right," Molly said, because if she didn't move, she would start crying again and then she'd never stop. "We eat something quick, then we start." "Percy and Audrey, you can." "No. You will not start alone. You can pair with Charlie and George on breakfast and bread sauce base. Bill and Arthur will handle the turkey prep when Arthur comes down. Fleur, if you want pastry." Fleur lifted a brow. "I want pastry." "Of course you do," Molly muttered, and then she caught herself and smiled despite it. "All right. You and I will do pastry. Together." Fleur's smile softened. Together, she agreed. It should have terrified Molly, letting Fleur into her pastry space. That it didn't. Not today. Today, having Fleur's skilled hands and sharp eyes felt like relief, like one less weight Molly had to carry. The kitchen came alive as more bodies filled it. Pans heated. The kettle boiled and whistled politely. The wooden spoons shifted slightly, but not in rebellion, more like interest, like they were leaning closer to listen. George insisted on singing while Charlie cooked. It was an awful song. It involved rhymes about bacon and heroic toast. Charlie tried to protest, then gave up and joined in, loud and off-key, because Charlie had always been the type to surrender to nonsense, when nonsense was the easiest way to feel joy. Percy attempted to make eggs, with the seriousness of a man defusing a bomb. Audrey gently nudged him into relaxing his shoulders. "It's breakfast, Percy," she murmured. "I know," Percy said, but he loosened anyway. Molly and Fleur worked side by side on pastry at the far counter. Fleur's technique was precise and beautiful. Molly's technique was practiced and instinctive. They were different styles, but somehow they fit. Fleur crimped edges with a delicate pinch that made the pastry look like lace. Molly rolled dough with steady pressure, hands sure and strong. "You are very good at this," Fleur said quietly, and Molly almost snapped out of habit. But then she heard the genuine respect in Fleur's tone and felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," Molly said, and meant it. Victoire banged her spoon on the high chair tray again and again, delighted by the noise. George responded by banging 2 measuring cups together like cymbals. The kitchen spoons in their crock swayed once, as if tempted to join, then settled again like they remembered they were supposed to behave today. Arthur came down last, looking sleepy but cheerful, wearing his newest jumper, the one Molly had knitted with the golden snitch pattern. He paused in the doorway and took in the crowded kitchen. Percy flipping eggs, Charlie stirring something while singing, George acting as Victoire's personal clown, Bill slicing bread with calm efficiency, Fleur and Molly at pastry, Audrey washing dishes as she went. Arthur's face softened. "Merry Christmas," he said, and his voice carried so much love that Molly felt it in her bones. "Merry Christmas, Arthur," Molly replied. Arthur stepped up behind her and kissed her temple, then reached for a bowl without asking, sliding naturally into the work. He didn't hover. He didn't try to take over. He simply joined, the way he always should have. Breakfast happened in a chaotic tide. Bacon slightly too crisp, eggs in various stages of success, toast piled high, tea poured in mismatched mugs. They ate standing up, leaning against counters, laughing when Percy nearly dropped a plate because the peeler tried to scoot away again the moment Audrey stepped aside. "Pears," George reminded, wagging a finger like a teacher. Percy shot him a glare. "I am aware." Bill nudged Percy lightly. "Let it go," he murmured, and Percy, astonishingly, did. When breakfast dishes were cleared, Molly felt the shift in the room, the tightening of focus. This was the moment, the transition from casual chaos to the work that mattered. "Turkey," Molly said, "it needs to come out of brine, be dried, stuffed, and into the oven." Bill and Arthur stepped forward immediately, shoulders aligned. "We've got it," Bill said. Molly almost gave specific herb measurements, almost told them exactly how to distribute stuffing, almost insisted on supervising every movement. Instead, she exhaled. "Sage and onion is traditional," she said. "But do what feels right. Don't make it bland." Arthur looked delighted by the freedom. Bill looked amused. "We won't, Mum," Bill promised. They lifted the turkey together, heavy and pale and dripping brine. The brine smell filled the kitchen briefly. Salt, herbs, citrus, sharp and clean. They set it in the roasting tin and began drying it carefully, hands moving with synchronized ease. Charlie leaned over Percy's shoulder. "I'll handle roast potatoes," he declared. "I have a relationship with heat." Percy raised a brow. You have a relationship with setting things on fire. Charlie shrugged. Same thing. Audrey stepped in smoothly. I'll do potatoes with you, she offered. 2 sets of hands. Charlie grinned. Brilliant. Pairing up with the sensible one. Percy, try not to faint. Percy's mouth twitched. I don't faint. George raised his hand. I've seen you faint. Percy glared. That was once. And it was because I was 12, and Ginny dropped a garden gnome in my lap. Ginny did not drop it. George corrected. She launched it. Molly's chest tightened at the mention of Ginny. Her absence felt strange, like a chair pulled away. Ginny would come later, she reminded herself. Ginny had promised Boxing Day. Ginny always came back. But the thought of Ginny walking into this kitchen, into Fred's enchantment, into the new tradition they were building, made something warm and aching bloom in Molly's ribs. They worked through the morning in dense, cooperative motion. Vegetables, parboiled, potatoes roughed up and shaken in a pot until their edges were fluffy and ready to crisp. Sprouts trimmed, chestnuts prepared, carrots sliced, parsnips arranged for glazing. The kitchen kept itself in line, like a creature pleased to see its lesson being respected. Utensils slid toward whoever needed them. Bowls arranged themselves within reach. Flames stayed steady. Nothing levitated unless someone asked. Nothing spun. Nothing ran away. It was, in its own strange way, helpful. Around midday, the Burrow's front rooms began to stir with more voices. A door opened upstairs. A laugh drifted down. Victoire squealed. At some point, Fleur began humming softly under her breath, a French lullaby that made the kitchen feel gentler, as if even the walls were listening. Molly caught George staring at the parchment on the table more than once. He'd placed it carefully under a clean weight, so it wouldn't smear or stain. Every time he looked, his face changed a fraction. Pride, grief, tenderness, all braided together. Molly wanted to reach out and smooth it away for him, like she used to smooth his hair when he was small. Instead, she said quietly, "You're doing all right." George blinked, startled by the directness. Then he nodded. "Better than I expected," he admitted. Molly's throat tightened. "He'd be proud of you." George's jaw flexed. "He'd be insufferable," George corrected, but his voice shook slightly. "He'd take credit for all of it." Molly managed a soft laugh. Yes, he would. By early afternoon, the house smelled like Christmas in the deepest sense. Roasting turkey and warm spices, caramelizing fat, a hint of brandy from the pudding basin, citrus from cranberries. It smelled like the years before war. It smelled like a home that refused to let grief be the only thing it remembered. Then the front gate squeaked again. Molly's head snapped up. George's eyes widened. "That'll be Ron," he said, with the resigned certainty of a man who had grown up hearing that specific gate squeak before a flood of noise. And sure enough, the front door burst open a moment later, and Ron's voice boomed through the hallway. "Merry Christmas. We're late? Don't yell. Hermione made us pack properly. Harry got stuck talking to someone at the ministry. Oi, is that turkey I can smell?" Molly felt a laugh bubble up, unexpectedly. Relief. Warmth. Home. She wiped her hands quickly and moved toward the doorway just as Ron barreled into the kitchen. Cheeks flushed, hair messy, carrying bags of gifts like they weighed nothing. Hermione followed, already apologizing, and Harry came behind her, hovering just at the edge of the room like he didn't want to intrude, like he still hadn't fully accepted that he belonged. Molly didn't let him hover. "Harry," she said, voice firm with affection, "come in. And before you ask, yes, you will help." Harry blinked, then smiled, small and grateful. "Yes, Mrs. Weasley." Ron sniffed loudly. "This smells incredible." "Ron," Molly said, pointing a flour-dusted finger at him, If you try to eat any potatoes before they're on the table, I will hex you." Ron looked offended. "I would never." George coughed. "You would always." Hermione's eyes landed on the kitchen with its coordinated chaos, on Percy chopping like he was drafting legislation, on Charlie and Audrey arguing over potato fat choices, on Bill and Arthur at the turkey, on Fleur at pastry, on Victoire banging her spoon like a tiny drummer. Hermione's brows lifted. "What is happening?" "Fred," George said, and waved the parchment like a flag. Hermione took it, read quickly, and her expression shifted from surprise to something tender. "Oh," she said softly. "Oh, Fred." Harry leaned in slightly, reading over Hermione's shoulder, and Molly saw the flicker in his face too. Recognition of love written in mischief, of family language. Ron grinned. "That's brilliant. So the kitchen won't work unless we all help." "Exactly," George said, "which means you, Ronald, are on bread sauce duty with Hermione. Together." Ron's grin faltered. "Bread sauce? Why me?" "Because," Molly said, "you need a job that keeps your hands busy and your mouth out of the roast potatoes." Ron opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. "Fine." Hermione looked delighted. "Bread sauce is fascinating historically." Ron lifted a hand. "Hermione." Later, Harry shifted awkwardly. "Mrs. Weasley, what should I do?" Molly's eyes stung, but she blinked it back quickly. "Cranberry sauce," she said. "Percy's favorite. And you'll do it with me." Harry's face softened. "With you," he repeated quietly, like the words meant more than the task. "Yes," Molly said firmly. "With me." They moved back into the flow as if they'd never been absent. The kitchen made room. Bodies adjusted. Hands passed bowls. Someone laughed when Ron tried to stir bread sauce too aggressively, and it spat at him like it was offended. "Pears," George reminded again, smug as anything. Ron scowled. "Stop saying pears like you invented it." George's grin was sharp and sad and bright all at once. "I didn't," he said. But he did. Molly's chest tightened. She kept stirring cranberries with Harry at her side. The berries popped and bled ruby into syrup. The scent of orange zest rose warm and sharp. Harry worked with quiet competence, hands steady, eyes attentive. He didn't chatter like Ron. He didn't lecture like Hermione. He simply did the work, and when Molly told him to add sugar, he added it without question, trusting her. After a few minutes, Harry spoke softly, eyes on the pot. "I still feel like a guest sometimes," he admitted, "like I'm borrowing someone else's family." Molly's throat tightened so hard she had to swallow twice before she could speak. "Harry James Potter," she said, and the full name carried the weight of her love like a spell. "You are not borrowing anything. You're family. You've been family for years. And if this kitchen is Fred's magic, then you can see it yourself. It's cooperating with you because it knows you belong here." Harry's eyes shone. He blinked quickly. "Thank you," he whispered. Molly nudged him lightly with her elbow before she could cry into cranberries. "Right now, keep stirring. Not too fast. And don't let Ron steal any of that bread sauce when he thinks no one's looking." Harry gave a small, shaky laugh. "I'll stop him." The afternoon pressed on, thick with warmth and noise. The Burrow became crowded in the way it always did at Christmas. Every room full, every hallway echoing with footsteps, every chair occupied by someone's elbow or someone's scarf. It was a joyful kind of overcrowding, the kind Molly had craved and feared at once. By the time the dinner hour approached, everything was nearly ready. The turkey rested golden and steaming, juices glistening. Potatoes crisped in the oven, edges crackling. Vegetables waited in dishes, ready for final glaze and heat. Gravy simmered, bread sauce thickened properly under Hermione's watchful eye, and Ron's begrudging stirring. The pudding steamed in its basin, heavy and fragrant, brandy and spice deep in the air. Molly stood at the center of her kitchen and looked around. Every person had flour on them somewhere. Every person had contributed. Percy's neat sleeves were dusted with starch. Fleur's hair had a faint dusting of flour near her temple. Charlie had something sticky on his hands and didn't know what it was. Ron had gravy on his jumper. Hermione was muttering about the structural integrity of Yorkshire pudding, and Arthur was listening with genuine interest. George stood near the wall, watching, eyes bright and haunted and full of love. And the kitchen, Fred's kitchen, hummed contentedly under it all. Molly felt a strange calm settle over her, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was shared. And for the first time in years, she understood the difference. By the time the clock's hands edged towards 6, the Burrow felt as if it had grown a few extra rooms by sheer force of togetherness. Bodies filled every corner. Voices overlapped like music. Someone had opened a window briefly to let out steam, and cold air had rushed in carrying the scent of snow and chimney smoke, only to be chased back out by warmth, laughter, and the steady heat of ovens that had been working all day. Molly stood at the kitchen table with her hands braced on the edge, breathing for a moment, letting the noise wash over her without trying to control it. For years, this hour had been the most dangerous time for her mind. This was the point in the day where she used to feel the fragile pressure of timing and expectation, where she used to tighten her grip on everything and become a machine built out of lists and responsibility. But now, she looked up and saw Bill and Arthur on one side of the kitchen, conferring over the turkey like two professionals, Arthur's enthusiasm balanced by Bill's calm competence. She saw Charlie leaning shoulder to shoulder with Audrey, both of them using 2 spoons to lift potatoes from a pot, as if they were handling dragon eggs. She saw Percy at the gravy station, stirring with solemn dedication, lips moving as if silently reciting a procedure. She saw Fleur at the pastry counter, coaxing her last tray of something delicate into shape, while Victoire patted dough with chubby hands like she was contributing to a masterpiece. She saw Ron hovering near the oven like a starving dog, Hermione blocking him with her body like a guardian, and Harry at the sink washing dishes without being asked, as if he'd always done it here. And she saw George, just slightly apart from the others, not isolated, but not fully in the thickest chaos either, watching it all with a look that broke Molly's heart and healed it at the same time. The kitchen hummed under their feet, not loud, not wild, but content, like a creature that had finally been fed. "Right," Molly said, voice carrying more authority than she felt. "We're nearly there. Everyone listen. We do not want a stampede into the dining room. We carry dishes in a sensible order." Ron raised a hand. "Define sensible." Molly pointed at him without looking. "Do not start, Ronald." George snorted. "Sensible means Ron doesn't get to carry anything breakable." Ron looked offended. "I can carry breakable things," Hermione said at the same moment. "No, you can't." Bill said with the faintest smile, "Love you, Ron, but she's right." Ron's expression betrayed him. He wasn't hurt. He was proud that everyone expected him to be chaos, like it was a role he accepted gladly because it meant he belonged. "Fine," Ron muttered. "I'll carry something unbreakable, like potatoes." "You will carry plates," Molly said. Ron opened his mouth to argue, but George cut in. "No solo missions, Ron. Kitchen rules." Ron scowled. "Stop saying that." George's grin flashed sharp and soft at once. "Never." Molly glanced at the Weasley clock. Every hand that mattered was pointed to home. Not just the literal word, but the deeper meaning. Together, safe, present. That sight hit her like a punch of gratitude. "All right," Molly said again, and this time her voice didn't shake. "Arthur, and Bill, turkey and carving board to the dining room. Charlie and Audrey, potatoes and vegetables. Percy, gravy. But do not spill it, or I will never forgive you. Percy's eyes widened slightly. I will not spill it. Hermione, bread sauce and sprouts. Ron, you help Hermione. Don't argue. Ron muttered something under his breath that sounded like tyranny, but he moved. Fleur, mince pies, and whatever you've made there. Fleur lifted her chin, proud. This is a delicate almond tart. Molly blinked. Fleur, why is there an almond tart? Fleur smiled sweetly. Because it is Christmas. Molly opened her mouth to protest, then shut it. Fine. Almond tart. Bring it. Harry, Molly added, and Harry's head lifted at once, attentive. You stay with me. We'll bring the cranberry sauce and whatever else is left. Harry nodded immediately. Yes, Mrs. Weasley. George, Molly said, and she felt the room tilt slightly as everyone's attention flicked to him. George, you... George looked at her, eyebrows raised, as if bracing for an order. Molly swallowed. For years, she would have given him something practical, something safe, something that didn't touch the raw ache in the center of the day. Instead, she said, You set the table place. George went very still. The room quieted in a way that Molly felt more than heard. Even Ron stopped chewing whatever he'd managed to steal. George's throat worked as he swallowed. The place? Molly nodded once. Fred's place, she said quietly. Between you and Ron, like always, for a moment, George looked like he might laugh or might break. Then he nodded, slow, deliberate. Right, he said softly. Right. I'll do it. And just like that, the kitchen moved again, motion resuming like breath after a held pause. Dishes were lifted, trays were carried, voices returned. The room flowed into a procession, bodies squeezing through doorways, passing each other with practiced familiarity. Molly stayed behind for a heartbeat, letting everyone go ahead. George lingered too, just for a second. He looked at her, and his voice was barely audible over the clatter. Thanks, Mum. Molly nodded, unable to speak. Harry appeared beside her, with the cranberry sauce jar in his hands, careful, respectful, like he was carrying something precious. The way his fingers gripped the jar reminded Molly of the way he'd once gripped a school bag strap when he first arrived at Hogwarts, as if he expected it to be taken away. You all right? Harry asked softly. Molly inhaled. Yes, she lied, then corrected herself. I'm getting there. Harry nodded as if he understood perfectly. Me too, he said. They carried the last dishes into the dining room. The table was extended to its full length, every extra leaf in place. It groaned under the weight of platters and bowls as dishes arrived in waves. Molly's best plates gleamed under candlelight. Christmas crackers lay neatly beside each setting. Sprigs of holly had been woven into the centerpiece, and someone, Hermione probably, had charmed the candles so they gave off a steady warm glow without dripping wax. The empty chair was there. George set it carefully. Plate, cutlery, a glass, a cracker, a napkin folded with almost absurd precision. Then, after a brief hesitation, he placed a small object beside the plate. Molly leaned closer, heart tightening. It was one of Fred's joke shop items, a tiny wind-up figurine that wobbled and danced when you touched it. It wasn't active now. It simply sat there, ridiculous and bright. George straightened and stepped back. No one spoke for a moment. Then Charlie cleared his throat loudly, because Charlie always had to break silence before it swallowed him. Right then, he said. Who's sitting where? I want to be near potatoes. Ron shoved him gently. You are potatoes. Percy astonishingly snorted. The tension loosened. They sat, The arrangement was chaotic but right. Arthur at the head, Molly at the other end. Bill and Fleur, with Victoire between them. Charlie near Audrey and Percy. Ron beside Hermione. Harry beside Ron, close enough that Ron could elbow him without thinking. George beside the empty chair, as if holding space for someone who wasn't visible but was still present. When everyone had settled, Arthur picked up his glass of pumpkin juice and lifted it. His eyes shone. He glanced at George, and something passed between them. Permission, understanding. George stood. The room quieted again. But this time it wasn't tense. It was expectant. George cleared his throat once. He looked around the table, at all of them, and Molly saw in his face the echo of Fred's grin, the same cheekbones, the same bright eyes, but also the difference, the weight of surviving. "All right, George," said voice steady. "Before we eat, and I'm starving, so I'll keep it short. I want to make a toast." Ron muttered, "It had better be short." And Hermione elbowed him hard enough that he shut up. George's mouth twitched. To Fred, he said, the words landed in the room like warmth. To Fred, they echoed back, glasses lifted. George swallowed, eyes bright. Who managed to annoy Mum even from beyond the grave? He continued, and a few people laughed softly through emotion. Who thought it was unacceptable that she should do everything alone? Who understood that Christmas isn't a performance where one person exhausts themselves to prove something? It's this. He gestured slightly at the table, the dishes, the messy hair, the flowers still visible on sleeves, the way Victoire was already trying to grab a cracker with both hands. It's being together, George said. It's making a mess and laughing at it. It's helping each other even when we're stubborn and don't want to admit we need help. It's food made with love. Even if it's slightly burnt, or the potatoes are different sizes, or the gravy is whatever color Percy has decided it should be. Percy looked offended. The gravy is a perfectly normal color. Charlie whispered loudly. It's brownish. Hermione whispered back. That's normal. George's lips trembled for a second. Then he steadied himself. It's also remembering, he said, not because we want to be sad, but because forgetting would be worse. So we set his place. We say his name. We let him be part of the noise. Molly's throat closed. She gripped her glass so hard her knuckles whitened. George lifted his glass higher. To Fred, he said again, voice breaking slightly, our brother, our son, our friend, our other half, still here in the walls of this ridiculous house, still making us laugh, still telling us what we need to hear. To Fred, they chorused again, and the sound of it was thick and real. Molly swallowed and drank, the pumpkin juice sweet and cold on her tongue. And for a moment, she could almost imagine another voice joining in, laughing, calling them saps. Arthur sat down and picked up the carving knife like a man about to conduct his own ceremony. Right, he said, voice bright, to push the moment toward life again. Let's eat before Ron starves to death. Ron took that as permission and immediately began loading his plate. Molly watched him with a mixture of horror and affection. He was still Ron, always hungry, always laughing, always making the world feel less heavy by refusing to be solemn for too long. The meal began. It was not the neat, perfectly timed feast Molly had planned in her head back in September. The turkey was slightly lopsided, carved a bit unevenly by Arthur's enthusiastic hand. The potatoes were glorious but not identical. The sprouts were actually good, which Molly suspected was Hermione's doing. The bread sauce was a touch thicker than Molly preferred, which Hermione insisted was historically accurate. The gravy was rich and dark and slightly peppery, which Percy defended as intentional. They ate until their plates were piled and then piled again. They passed dishes back and forth, with elbows bumping. They argued cheerfully about who got the crispiest turkey skin. Ron tried to sneak extra potatoes and was caught by Audrey, who slapped his hand with surprising speed. I have brothers too, Audrey warned him, smiling. Don't try it. Ron looked impressed. Respect. Victoire managed to get cranberry sauce on her cheek, her chin, and somehow her forehead. Fleur tried to wipe it, and Victoire squealed and smeared more. Bill laughed quietly and let Victoire grab his finger with sticky hands. The sight of Bill laughing like that, at ease, made Molly's chest ache with love. Harry ate slowly, as if savoring every bite, eyes flicking around the table like he was memorizing it. Molly saw him glance at the empty chair, more than once, not with fear, with something like acceptance. At some point, Hermione began telling a story about Auror training, Harry accidentally turning someone's teacup into a frog. Ron laughed so hard he nearly choked. Harry protested, cheeks pink. It was an accident. Hermione waved a hand. It was a fascinating accident. George leaned forward. If I'd been there, I'd have sold that frog teacup combo in the shop. Limited edition. Ron snorted. You'd sell anything. George's grin flashed. And you'd buy it. The room filled with laughter. Molly watched it all and felt, for the first time in years, something like ease settle deep in her bones. The dinner wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was alive. It was shared. It was. When plates were finally cleared, after Ron attempted to convince everyone that dessert could be considered a second dinner, and Percy declared that technically dessert was a separate course with its own rules, Arthur stood and clapped his hands. Right, pudding, he announced. Molly's heart gave a small jolt. The pudding mattered. It always did. It was her centerpiece, her symbol, the dish that felt like proof. But she didn't move alone. Charlie stood at once. I'll get it, he declared. Molly opened her mouth to instruct him, then stopped. Pairing, she reminded herself. Bill rose too. I'll help. Charlie and Bill went into the kitchen together. Molly heard the clink of the pudding basin being lifted, the murmur of voices, the laughter when Charlie whispered something about dragon egg incubation again, and Bill told him to shut up. They returned with the pudding on a platter, wrapped and steaming. The scent hit the room. Brandy, spice, dried fruit, deep warmth. Arthur produced a bottle of brandy with ridiculous ceremony. He poured it over the pudding with exaggerated care. Then he looked around the table and lifted his wand. Everyone lean back slightly, he said. Ron leaned back too far and nearly fell off his chair. Hermione grabbed his sleeve and hauled him upright with a glare. Arthur lit the pudding. Flames bloomed blue and gold, dancing over the dark surface. The room glowed. Victoire clapped wildly, delighted. The candles flickered as if joining the celebration. Molly felt tears prick her eyes, not because of the flames, but because of the ritual being shared, because of the way everyone leaned in together, because of the empty chair beside George, catching the flame light like it was part of it all. Arthur carried the flaming pudding carefully and set it down. The flames faded to smoke. The room exhaled like it had held its breath. There, Molly whispered, and she didn't mean just the pudding. There, this is it. Dessert passed in laughter and warmth. Cracker jokes that were terrible. Paper hats worn at ridiculous angles. Percy refusing at first, then putting on a hat anyway because Audrey insisted. Harry wearing his hat for far longer than anyone else, like he didn't want to let the silliness end. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room. Someone put logs on the fire. Victoire fell asleep in Fleur's arms, thumb in mouth, cheeks still faintly stained pink from cranberry sauce. Charlie dozed in an armchair almost immediately, head tilted back, like a man who could sleep anywhere. Percy sat with a mug of tea and listened to Ron's rambling story about some ridiculous Auror exercise, occasionally offering a dry correction that made everyone laugh. George sat on the floor by the fireplace, close enough to feel heat, far enough that he had room. Fred's parchment lay beside him on the carpet, smoothed flat. He stared at it as if it were a map. Molly watched him, heart aching. She crossed the room and lowered herself beside him, slower than she used to be, joints reminding her that years had passed. She didn't speak at first. She simply sat. George's voice came quietly. "You know what's mad?" Molly waited. "He designed this 3 years ago," George said, fingers brushing the parchment's edge. "Before the war got really bad. Before we knew how it would end. Before—" his voice snagged. "Before we knew I'd be the one left to read it." Molly's throat tightened. "George—" "No, let me finish," George said quickly, like he needed to get the words out before he lost courage. "He designed it because he knew you, because he knew you'd try to carry all of us on your own back until you broke. He was trying to protect you. He was trying to protect all of us from you turning into someone who only serves and never sits." Molly's eyes burned. She didn't deny it, because denial felt useless now. George swallowed. "But I think he knew something else too," George said. "I think part of him knew he might not be here to see it work. That's why he made it permanent. That's why he wrote it down. That's why he built it into the house, like it was part of the foundations. He wanted to make sure he stayed." Molly's vision blurred. She leaned forward and wrapped her arms around George, pulling him in. He resisted for half a second, then folded into her with a shaky exhale like a child again, for just one heartbeat. "He is here," Molly whispered fiercely into his hair. "He is. In this. In you. In every ridiculous spoon that decides to conduct. He's here." George's voice was muffled against her shoulder. "I know," he said. "Some days it doesn't feel like enough. But today I can hear him laughing." Molly closed her eyes. "Me too," she whispered. Around them, the room was quiet in the way it became when everyone was full and warm and tired. The fire crackled. Outside, snow fell softly against the windows. Arthur's voice drifted from the sofa. "Next year," he said, "we do it again. All of it. Together." Ron's muffled voice responded. "Next year, I'm in charge of potatoes." Molly barked a laugh. "Absolutely not." Hermione's voice followed, amused. "Ronald, you'd eat them before they were cooked." Percy's dry tone cut in. "There will need to be rules." George lifted his head slightly, eyes bright. "We can write an accord," he said suddenly. Molly blinked. "An accord?" George's grin returned, softer than Fred's but shaped by the same mischief. "Something official. Something we all sign, so no one forgets what he wanted." Percy's eyes lit up in alarmed interest. "I can draft it." Audrey laughed softly. "Of course you can." Molly should have rolled her eyes. Instead, she felt warmth swell in her chest. "Yes," she said. "Yes. We'll write it. We'll make it a tradition. We'll honor it properly." George's grin widened. Fred would love that. They moved back toward the kitchen, drawn by the need to do something practical with emotion. The kitchen waited, quiet and content. The utensils sat properly in their places. The Weasley clock ticked steadily. The house hummed like it was listening. Percy fetched parchment and quill with solemn purpose. Hermione suggested wording. Ron suggested adding a clause about unlimited potatoes. Molly shot him down immediately. Arthur laughed and spilled tea and then cleaned it up without being asked. Fleur signed with elegant script. Bill added his name with calm steadiness. Charlie signed with a flourish like he was branding a dragon. Audrey wrote neatly, smiling. Harry hesitated, then signed when Molly told him firmly that he was family, and this was his home. George signed twice, once for himself, once for Fred, copying his twin's untidy scroll as best he could, hand shaking slightly, lips pressed tight. Molly watched him do it and felt tears slide down her cheeks without shame. Arthur performed a preservation charm and stuck the parchment to the kitchen wall beside the family clock. There, Molly said softly. It's official. And, as if the house approved, a wooden spoon in the crock shifted slightly, then settled. Molly stood in the center of her kitchen with her family around her, laughter still in the air, grief still present, but shared, and felt something settle in her chest, like peace. Not perfect peace, real peace. Then Ron's voice rose again, already hungry. So who wants tea and biscuits, and also maybe a little turkey sandwich? Molly laughed, wiping at her cheeks. Tea, yes. Sandwich, you are incorrigible. Arthur lifted the kettle like a trophy. I'll put it on. Bill reached for cups. I'll get mugs. George grinned and lifted a spoon like a conductor. And I, he declared, will keep the spoons in line. The kitchen filled with movement again, small and warm and ordinary. And under it all, Fred's magic purred, satisfied. Because the lesson had been learned. Because no one was alone. Because Christmas, messy and imperfect and full of love, had finally become exactly what it was always supposed to be.